What if the crown's greatest secret was that it remembers everything it pretends to forget? Behind the gold, the gowns, and the carefully choreographed smiles lies a family archive soaked in silence where loyalty means exile and tradition hides betrayal. For nearly 1,000 years, Britain's royal family has mastered the art of elegant omission. But tonight, we open the locked drawers, the burned letters, the vanished cousins, the diamond stolen from a child. This isn't history, it's inheritance. Welcome to 53 of the darkest royal secrets they'd rather you never remember because they never really forgot. Before we pull back the velvet curtain, make sure you're subscribed to the channel. This rabbit hole goes deep, and trust me, you won't want to climb back out alone. Drop a comment below. Where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it right now? Midnight? 3 a.m.? Funny how royal secrets always sound better after dark. William the Conqueror burned entire villages in the harrying of the North, leaving thousands to starve. The North had a mood: cold, obstinate, suspicious of outsiders and, to William the Conqueror, dangerously disloyal. After his supposedly glorious victory at Hastings in 1066, the new King of England didn't walk into peaceful adoration. Instead, he found a country that refused to be tamed, particularly the northern earldoms, where rebellion simmered like a pot, with the lid held down by shaky hands. So William did what most insecure men with absolute power tend to do. He overreacted. The official term for what followed is the harrying of the North. It sounds almost whimsical, like a medieval prank gone too far. But what it actually describes is one of the earliest and most systematic campaigns of scorched earth terror in English history. Between 1069 and 1070, William ordered entire villages razed. Crops were burned in the field. Livestock were slaughtered en masse. Orchards which take years to bear fruit were chopped down with a kind of joyless precision. It wasn't just war, it was punishment, but not of the guilty of everyone. Men, women, children, all starved alike in the smouldering skeleton of Yorkshire and beyond. The Domesday Book, written over a decade later, still lists entire swaths of land as waste. Not abandoned, not unproductive, wasted, as in ruined beyond use, as in nothing left to take. Estimates vary. Of course, records were patchy, and truth was even patchier. But some modern historians place the death toll between 75,000 and 100,000. That's not collateral damage. That's policy. And why? Because William believed that fear built thrones. Not admiration, not legitimacy, not even divine right, though he claimed it when it suited him. Just fire, hunger, and silence. The silence part is key. There are no surviving first-hand testimonies from the victims, no northern diary entries or desperate pleas preserved in monastery walls. Just absence the kind of historical void that suggests a crime so complete, even memory didn't survive it. Yet William thrived. He tightened his grip, built castles, reshaped the feudal system in his image, and died with his empire mostly intact. The official story still calls him the Conqueror, though the arsonist might be more apartment. And fittingly, even in death, his body reportedly exploded during burial, an emperor finally bursting from within after a lifetime of imploding others. It's funny, in a bleak sort of way. The man who tried to make the land submit by turning it into ash was ultimately buried under it. Rot, after all, is an equalizer. But his legacy stuck around in borders redrawn, power redistributed, and a monarchy cemented in blood-soaked soil. And yet, The brutality of the harrying is often skipped in schoolbooks, like an awkward footnote that might make patriotism harder to sell. Turns out, national myth prefers winners, not war criminals. Which brings us neatly to William's descendant, a man who also won, ruled, and rewrote the rules by starving someone else for power. But this time, it wasn't the countryside that starved. It was family. King John of Magna Carta fame starved political prisoners, including his own nephew Arthur. King John is the kind of royal figure who inspires the word infamous to do heavy lifting. He's remembered, if at all, as the sulky Plantagenet who was forced to sign the Magna Carta, essentially getting checkmated by a bunch of angry barons who didn't appreciate being taxed into the ground. But long before that parchment humiliation at Runnymede in 1215, John had already earned his place in the Royal Rogues Gallery, not because he lost Normandy, not because he bankrupted the crown, not even because he once tried to seduce a teenage daughter of a noble ally, though. Yes, he did that too. John's real legacy is a quieter one, the kind of evil you don't hear over battle drums, the kind that happens in castles, behind stone walls, where the only sound is the echo of a locked door. One such door belonged to a cell holding Arthur of Brittany, John's teenage nephew, and a legitimate threat to his claim to the throne. Arthur was the son of John's older brother Geoffrey, and therefore had a stronger hereditary right than John ever did. And in a royal family where bloodlines are everything and paranoia is a form of governance, that made Arthur disposable. According to chroniclers, Arthur was captured during a siege and imprisoned. The records get vague after that, conveniently vague. Some say John killed him with his own hands. Others whisper about a nighttime execution. But one version, both plausible and chilling in its cruelty, is that John simply let him waste away. No knife, no poison, just absence. No food, no visitors, no escape. Just a teenage boy whose only crime was being born closer to the crown. John didn't stop there. Other political prisoners, barons who opposed him, clergymen who got in his way, were said to suffer similar fates, starved, forgotten, dissolved into silence. It was efficient in its way. No public trial, no rallying cries. Just the slow removal of obstacles, as if the throne were a game of chess played by a man who always knocked the pieces off the board when he was losing. And when rebellion inevitably came, as it always does with tyrants too short-sighted to bribe or charm their enemies, John caved. The Magna Carta wasn't a peace offering, it was a leash, and he hated it. He died not long after, likely from dysentery, though poetic justice fans might prefer to imagine he choked on one of his own royal feasts. His reign, short on glory and long on cruelty, left the kingdom in chaos. And yet, he became a building block for the myth of British liberty, an accidental midwife to democracy, who tortured his way into the history books as a cautionary tale. Still, his particular blend of paranoid governance and family betrayal would echo through generations, including in the cold pragmatism of his descendant, a king who believed in walls, swords, and something far worse, forced absence, but this time at a national scale. Hard to believe that's just the second secret. There are 51 more waiting in the shadows. If you're still with us, you clearly like your history a little darker. So go ahead and subscribe, you've earned it. And while you're here, tell me in the comments, where are you tuning in from, and what time is it right now? Always curious who else is up late, wandering through the ruins of royalty. Edward I expelled all Jews from England in 1290, seizing their property. Edward I, known in military legend as Longshanks, is often remembered for hammering Scotland with brutal campaigns and building castles that still loom like ghosts across the Welsh countryside. He's a favourite among Imperial nostalgics, the kind of monarch who gets cinematic treatment as a bold, towering symbol of medieval strength. But if you look past the chainmail and crown, you find something far less noble. Edward wasn't just a conqueror of land. He was a master of moral accounting, a king who used discrimination as policy, theft as governance, and religion as camouflage. In 1290, Edward issued the Edict of Expulsion, which did exactly what it sounds like. It kicked every Jew out of England. All of them. Families who had lived there for generations. Merchants. Physicians. Children. Gone. Within months, an entire population, thousands of people were erased from English soil. Why? Because Edward decided their usefulness had expired. Jews had been a convenient financial tool for the crown. Barred from most trades, they were steered into money-lending, a profession the Christian elite both needed and condemned. Kings borrowed heavily from Jewish lenders, then turned public resentment against them when debts got uncomfortable. It was political sleight of hand. Take the money, stir the hatred, seize the assets. Edward squeezed England's Jewish community for everything they were worth, quite literally. He taxed them into oblivion, enacted harsh restrictions, and allowed mobs to attack them with impunity. Then, once they were financially depleted and politically isolated, he made their very existence illegal. He didn't just expel them. He took their property, their homes, their land, and transferred it to the crown or to loyal barons. It was a clean sweep, ethnic cleansing disguised as royal housekeeping. And it worked. For 350 years, England had no legally recognized Jewish population. That silence wasn't just political, it was cultural, spiritual, generational. A medieval ghosting of an entire people. And Edward? He went back to castle building, war waging, and myth-making. By the time he died, he was regarded as one of the greatest English kings, a unifier of realms, a lawmaker, a warrior. No mention in his epitaph of what he left behind, a country slightly richer and infinitely smaller in soul. But for all his attempts at control, Edward couldn't erase the idea that cruelty has a shelf life. His descendants would face rebellions far closer to home, ones that couldn't be taxed, expelled, or excommunicated into submission. Especially when those rebellions came not from minority communities, but from within the working class itself. Richard II ordered the brutal executions of rebels during the Peasants Revolt. Richard II ascended the throne at 10 years old, which sounds like the start of a fairy tale but ends more like a Kafka story set in chainmail. His reign is often painted with strange contrasts. A child king thrust into chaos, a patron of the arts obsessed with pageantry, a monarch both sensitive and savage. But the most formative moment of Richard's rule, and arguably his most revealing, happened when he was just 14. The year was 1381. England was simmering. The Peasants Revolt, one of the most misunderstood uprisings in English history, erupted not from sudden madness, but from long-standing grievances. Crushing taxes, post-plague economic strain, and a sense that the crown was treating its subjects more like livestock than citizens. It was a workers' revolt before capitalism even had a name. Led by figures like Wat Tyler, the rebels marched on London with surprising coordination. They weren't just angry, they were organized. They had demands: end the poll tax, remove corrupt officials, offer legal reforms, reasonable requests if you weren't a king surrounded by terrified nobles. And here's where Richard stepped into the myth. He rode out to meet the rebels, not once, but twice. He made promises. He calmed the crowd. He told them he understood. He even declared himself their champion. It was one of the most impressive acts of teenage political theatre in medieval Europe. and then he broke every single promise. After Tyler was murdered under suspicious circumstances during the second meeting, Richard flipped the script. The boy king who spoke of fairness turned into an avenging autocrat. He ordered mass arrests, executions, and purges. Dozens of rebels were dragged through mock trials and put to death. Their leaders' heads were displayed on spikes. Their families were left to rot in poverty. The royal machine shifted gears from diplomacy to retribution in record time. Richard's betrayal wasn't just personal, it was institutional. It sent a clear message: don't mistake royal charm for mercy. Behind the smooth words and youthful glow was a monarch who had learned early that control doesn't come from love. It comes from fear, and heads on spikes are louder than reforms on parchment. The revolt was crushed, but the discontent never died. It just went underground. The seeds of English class struggle had been sown not in Marxist manifestos, but in the blood and silence of rural fields. And Richard? He'd be overthrown later in life, deposed by his cousin Henry Bolingbroke, stripped of power, and quietly disappeared. Poetic justice, perhaps. But before that, he passed on something more contagious than rebellion. The idea that a smiling monarch can turn into a tyrant the moment power is challenged. Next came a king who smiled less, conquered more, and made heretics wish they had simply revolted. Henry V burned heretics alive, including Lollard preachers. Henry V is best known for his rousing speeches, heroic battles, and being Kenneth Branagh's favourite Shakespearean cosplay. In national mythology, he's the golden boy, the one who turned a wild youth into noble kingship, defeated the French at Agincourt, and died too soon, like some medieval James Dean. But that's just the theatrical lighting. Tilt the stage, and you find another Henry, one obsessed with order, orthodoxy, and burning anything or anyone that didn't fit his script. To understand Henry's darker legacy, you have to meet the Lollards. These were followers of John Wycliffe, a 14th century theologian who had the nerve to suggest that ordinary people should be able to read the Bible in English. Revolutionary, yes. Dangerous. Only if your entire kingdom is built on the idea that truth flows down from the throne and the altar not up from the people. The Lollards also had other unsettling ideas, that priests should live modestly, that church wealth was corrupting, and that faith didn't require cathedrals dripping in gold. To the monarchy and the church, this wasn't just heresy. It was bad for business. Henry's response? Zero tolerance. Under his reign, the burning of heretics became not only law, but spectacle. Parliament passed the statute De Heretico Comburendo, a name that sounds like a potion, but was actually a license to extinguish religious dissent with extreme prejudice. Trials were held, confessions were coerced, punishments were final. Henry's defenders liked to claim he was just enforcing the orthodoxy of the time. But the truth is more revealing. He saw rebellion not only in swords, but in sermons, and he acted accordingly. In his eyes, a preacher challenging the clergy was no different from a soldier defying the king. Both threatened the divine chain of command, and Henry, ever the tactician, preferred to strike early, while the enemy still looked like a farmer with a pamphlet rather than a mob with torches. The irony? His own reign would benefit immensely from the kind of populism he crushed. His victories abroad earned him love at home, but they also depended on rallying the common people, the same class he was quietly suppressing in the name of religious purity. He died young, at 35, with France halfway conquered and England briefly united behind him. But his legacy, the violent fusion of church and crown, the silencing of dissent in the name of unity, would echo for generations. especially in the hands of a future king who knew a thing or two about disposing of inconvenient relatives and inconvenient heirs. Richard III is accused of murdering his 2 young nephews, the princes in the Tower. Richard III wasn't supposed to be king. He was the spare's spare, a loyal brother, a capable general, a trusted advisor. But when his brother Edward IV died unexpectedly in 1483, Richard saw opportunity. Or maybe he saw chaos. Maybe both. What's certain is this. Within months, Richard declared his nephews illegitimate, locked them away in the Tower of London for their protection, and had himself crowned king. The 2 boys, Edward V, just 12, and his younger brother Richard of Shrewsbury, were never seen again. Their disappearance is one of the oldest and most enduring cold cases in British history. No trials, no public statements, no bodies found until centuries later, when 2 small skeletons were discovered under a staircase in the Tower, still cloaked in mystery. The official version, the Tudor version, paints Richard as the ultimate villain, a deformed usurper who murdered children to steal a crown. Shakespeare took that version and ran with it, turning Richard into a hunchbacked sociopath who practically twirls a mustache while plotting regicide. But history is rarely that simple. Some revisionists argue that Richard may have been innocent, that the boys were killed by someone else, perhaps the Duke of Buckingham, perhaps Henry Tudor himself. That Richard's reputation was smeared by the victors, and he died a scapegoat in battle, not a monster in truth. But even if Richard didn't wield the blade himself, the power play is hard to deny. He seized the throne with remarkable speed. He neutralized rivals with surgical precision, and he ruled for just 2 years, years marked by paranoia, rebellion, and, ultimately, betrayal. His end came at Bosworth Field, where Henry Tudor defeated him and became Henry VII. Richard's crown was found in a bush. His body was tossed in a shallow grave. Centuries later, when his remains were found beneath a parking lot, it felt like poetic justice or tragic irony, depending on your view of history. What lingers is the silence. The Tower, once a royal residence, now echoes with ghosts and rumours. The princes never grew up, never ruled, never even had the chance to speak. Their story remains unfinished, buried not just in stone, but in doubt. Richard's legacy is a Rorschach test, tyrant or tragic figure, murderer or maligned. What's certain is this. In a monarchy that claimed divine order, 2 royal children vanished without a trace. And the man who benefited most wore the crown until he died, sword in hand, reputation in flames. The next king would take a different approach, less mystery, more muscle. He wouldn't bother with whispers and towers. He'd build an empire of fear with iron chains, secret chambers, and a tax plan that made betrayal profitable. Henry VII used torture chambers to secure loyalty and wealth. Henry VII was not a romantic king. He wasn't heroic, charismatic, or even especially liked. He didn't inspire plays or legends. What he inspired was compliance, the kind that comes when people fear you more than they hate you. After seizing the crown from Richard III at Bosworth in 1485, Henry knew one thing with absolute clarity. His claim was paper thin. He was a Tudor in a country that still remembered Plantagenets. His right to rule depended entirely on his ability to prevent rebellion, suppress rivals, and make himself indispensable to the realm's elite. He did this not with pageantry, but with policy. Not with glory, but with paranoia, and yes, with torture. Henry VII established a reign so bureaucratic in its cruelty that it almost felt modern. He used the court system as a trap, creating bonds and recognizances that financially punished noblemen for even the suspicion of disloyalty. These weren't fines, they were political chokeholds. Pay up, stay quiet, or disappear. Behind the legal language was something darker. Henry created special tribunals and chambers like the infamous council learned in the law, which operated in secrecy beyond the reach of traditional justice. These weren't courts, they were pressure cookers. Nobles who found themselves summoned rarely came out richer or freer. And if intimidation didn't work, more physical methods were rumoured. Though records are scarce and conveniently vague, the Tower of London remained active under Henry's reign. Political prisoners often vanished into it, emerging broken or not at all. The message was clear: loyalty wasn't optional, and suspicion was a debt you paid with your fortune or your body. The irony is that Henry wasn't bloodthirsty, he preferred control over carnage. His cruelty was calculated, not impulsive. Every punishment was a ledger entry. Every confiscated estate was a boost to royal income. By the time he died, the monarchy was wealthier than it had been in generations, and the aristocracy was quieter than it had ever dared to be. He passed the throne to his son Henry VIII, with the crown secure, the treasury full, and the nobles too terrified to blink. But he also passed down something else: the blueprint for using fear as policy. Not theatrical tyranny, administrative tyranny, the kind that comes with a seal and a signature. And his son would take that blueprint and double it, triple it, turn it into a dynasty of decapitations, dissolutions, and dismembered alliances. But first marriage, always marriage. Followed, of course, by annulment, scandal, and the kind of moral whiplash that only a Tudor could deliver. Henry VIII executed 2 of his 6 wives, Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, under dubious charges. Henry VIII is the kind of monarch who doesn't need an introduction, he brings his own. 6 wives, 2 beheadings, a split with Rome, and a stomach that grew proportionally with his appetite for power. He's often remembered as a larger-than-life figure, the Renaissance king who couldn't take no for an answer, especially from the Pope. But beneath the royal swagger, beneath the portraits and propagandized masculinity, lies something quieter, something more unsettling. A pattern of discarding people, especially women, the moment they became inconvenient. Anne Boleyn was wife number 2. She was bold, educated, and politically savvy. Everything a 16th century court found both fascinating and dangerous. She had helped Henry break from the Catholic Church, endured years of scandal to finally marry him, and gave birth to Elizabeth, the daughter who would one day rule more capably than either parent. But when she failed to produce a male heir, the tides turned. Whispers grew into accusations: adultery, incest, witchcraft, charges so implausible they read like a political cartoon. And yet, they stuck. She was arrested, tried, and found guilty in a court that had already decided the verdict. Some say Henry knew the charges were false. Others say he believed what he wanted to believe. Either way, the outcome was the same. Anne was removed, not just from power, but from history. Her reputation reduced to a footnote until her daughter restored her memory, decades later. Catherine Howard came later, wife number 5. She was young, naive, and, most tragically, part of a noble family who saw her as social currency. Her past, and the rumour of unapproved relationships, was brought against her in a court that prized virginity more than truth. Once again, the king heard what he needed to hear. Once again, the outcome was final. Henry's apologists argue that he was acting within the bounds of law, that he was a product of his time. But law in Henry's England was elastic, stretched to fit the will of the king, contracted to silence those who questioned it. And time, well, it's always someone's time. What made these deaths more than just personal tragedies was what they revealed about Henry's statecraft. Loyalty was conditional, affection was transactional, and marriage was just another battlefield. He didn't simply divorce women, he erased them. He turned them into moral parables, warnings to others, justifications to himself. And the public? They watched, they whispered, they adapted. Power, after all, has a way of normalizing even the most grotesque theatre. And Henry's court became a stage where survival meant never stepping out of line, especially if you were a woman. But this wasn't the full extent of his damage. Henry wasn't just in the business of destroying wives. He also turned his kingdom's spiritual life upside down, and in the process seized a fortune built on prayer, peace, and centuries of quiet faith. Henry VIII dissolved monasteries, seizing wealth and leaving monks, nuns, and the poor destitute. The English Reformation wasn't just about divorce, it was about property. And Henry VIII, ever the opportunist, didn't just want a new wife, he wanted an empire that didn't answer to Rome. In breaking from the Catholic Church, he found himself not just spiritually autonomous, but suddenly in charge of vast swaths of land, treasure, and influence. And he wasted no time putting them to use. The dissolution of the monasteries between 1536 and 1541 sounds like a theological process. It wasn't. It was a real estate scheme disguised as religious reform. Henry sent commissioners to inspect monastic houses across the country, often accusing them of corruption or idleness. The accusations didn't need to be accurate, just useful. Once condemned, the monasteries were disbanded. Their lands were seized. Their valuables were sent to the crown. Their occupants, monks, nuns, lay brothers, were forced out, pensioned off, or left to beg. What was lost wasn't just property. Monasteries had been social centres, hospitals, schools, and poorhouses. They were the rural safety net in a society that hadn't invented the concept yet. When they were stripped away, so too were the support systems for thousands of ordinary people. Hunger increased, homelessness spiked, and the wealth that once sustained communities flowed upward into royal coffers, into the hands of newly loyal aristocrats who bought monastic land at bargain prices. Henry became incredibly rich, but his England became spiritually fractured. The Reformation introduced a theological mess that would unravel across generations: wars, counter-reformations, purges. But at the heart of it all was the same formula: crown over cross, king over conscience. It's often framed as progress, the start of England's modern age, but it was also plunder, executed with a bureaucrat's pen and a soldier's sword. And it revealed, perhaps more than any of Henry's marriages, his true belief system. Not Catholic or Protestant, not faith or heresy, but control. Control of land, control of people, control of God's voice in a nation that was no longer allowed to hear it for themselves. The consequences didn't just linger, they calcified. For centuries, England's religious institutions would be reshaped around this power grab, their loyalties always shifting toward the throne, never the altar. And the poor, the sick, the devout, they were just collateral damage. But Henry's daughter Mary would later take this conflict and twist it further, believing that heresy wasn't just a threat to power, but to salvation itself. And she, unlike her father, didn't dissolve institutions. She incinerated them. Mary, Bloody Mary, burned nearly 300 Protestants alive. Mary Tudor inherited a country already split at the seams. Her father had torn England from the Pope. Her brother Edward had doubled down on Protestantism, and she, as the devout Catholic daughter of Catherine of Aragon, believed it was her divine duty to sew the old fabric back together using fire if necessary. Mary wasn't interested in compromise. When she became queen in 1553, she set out to reverse the Reformation. Her goal wasn't just to restore Catholicism, but to undo what she saw as a betrayal of her mother, her country, and her soul. And for Mary, restoration didn't mean dialogue, it meant punishment. Over the next 5 years, nearly 300 people were executed for heresy. Many of them were ordinary men and women preachers, artisans, even teenagers whose only crime was refusing to recant their Protestant faith. Some were prominent churchmen. Others were barely known in their own parishes. All became martyrs in what came to be known as the Marian persecutions. What makes these executions particularly haunting is their deliberate theatricality. The burnings were public, meant to terrify as much as punish. Heretics were paraded through towns, condemned not only by law but by their neighbours. The goal wasn't just doctrinal purity, it was fear-based conformity, a return to unity by way of spectacle. Mary earned her infamous nickname Bloody Mary, not because she killed more than other monarchs, she didn't, but because of how pointed and personal those killings felt. They weren't political enemies, they were theological opponents, and they were meant to serve as warnings. To her credit, if credit applies, Mary truly believed she was saving souls. That to burn a heretic was to stop a contagion, but history doesn't reward intention. It remembers impact, and hers was searing. Ironically, her reign only deepened the Protestant resolve. The victims she created became icons. Their stories were written down, published, spread like wildfire by figures such as John Foxy in his Book of Martyrs. The more she tried to stamp out Protestantism, the more she elevated its martyrs to near sainthood. Mary died without an heir, tormented by illness and legacy. She left the crown to her half-sister Elizabeth, who took the throne with a steady hand and a much colder heart. Mary tried to heal the soul of England and broke its body instead. Elizabeth, ever the pragmatist, wouldn't waste time on souls. She had other enemies in mind, especially the ones who dared pray in Latin. Elizabeth I authorized torture of Catholic priests in the Tower. Elizabeth I is often romanticized as the Golden Monarch, a woman alone on the throne, draped in pearls and metaphors, vanquishing the Spanish Armada while tossing out Shakespeare quotes before breakfast. Her reign is painted in gold leaf, the Elizabethan age, full of exploration, poetry, and prosperity. But behind the gilded image was a ruler made of colder material, one who understood that power is rarely maintained through sonnets and naval victories alone. What Elizabeth inherited wasn't just a kingdom, it was a crisis. England was a religious fracture held together with policy glue. Her father, Henry VIII, had founded the Church of England out of spite. Her half-brother Edward had hardened it into doctrine. Her half-sister Mary had tried to burn it all down and build Catholicism from the ashes. Elizabeth's solution was something called the Elizabethan religious settlement, a kind of theological compromise that pleased nobody, but at least reduced open war. On paper. In reality, Elizabeth's government was extremely hostile toward Catholicism, especially when it came with foreign backing. The papal bull of 1570, which declared Elizabeth illegitimate and called for her overthrow, transformed every Catholic priest into a potential traitor. And the Queen responded the way most monarchs do when they feel their throne wobble. She doubled down. Catholic priests who continued to minister in secret were hunted as enemies of the state. Many were captured, imprisoned, and interrogated. The Tower of London, still standing from her predecessor's reigns, once again became the stage for whispered confessions and unanswered cries. Among the most feared rooms was the infamous Little Ease, where prisoners couldn't stand, sit, or lie down fully. Other chambers were built not for comfort, but for pressure, psychological and otherwise. Elizabeth never personally operated the tools of enforcement, but she didn't need to. She delegated with brutal efficiency. Her advisors, like Sir Francis Walsingham, ran an intelligence network that would impress modern surveillance states. Letters were intercepted, secret masses were infiltrated. And when a suspect was found, the route was familiar: arrest, isolation, interrogation, and often a trial that felt more like ceremony than justice. And yet, Elizabeth maintained the public image of tolerance. Her reign is often remembered for its intellectual brilliance, not its brutal silencing. The contradiction is jarring. The queen who patronized poets also imprisoned preachers. The monarch who claimed religious balance also made Catholicism a national security threat. What emerges from this paradox is a portrait of Elizabeth as neither villain nor saint, but as a ruler navigating a minefield and willing to let others explode if it meant keeping her shoes clean. She didn't enjoy cruelty, but she allowed it. And in the margins of her otherwise celebrated reign, there are stories not of glory, but of silence. Which brings us to her successor, a man obsessed with noise, gunpowder, smoke, and the terrifying idea that his subjects were consorting with devils instead of diplomats. James I ordered witch hunts and gruesome executions of witches. James I, first of the Stuarts, arrived in England with a crown on his head and a demon in his imagination. Raised on intrigue and paranoia in the Scottish court, James brought with him not just royal blood, but a deeply personal obsession with the supernatural, specifically with witches. Long before he inherited the English throne in 1603, James had already dabbled in the business of hunting witches in Scotland. His involvement in the infamous North Berwick witch trials of the 1590 seconds was not merely ceremonial. He attended interrogations, issued proclamations, and even wrote a book about it. Daemonology, published in 1597, laid out his belief that witches were real, organized, and actively conspiring with the devil to undermine godly rule. That he believed himself to be a specific target of their plots made the matter less theological and more personal. Once he took the English throne, the machinery of monarchy gained a new gear: spiritual terror. Witchcraft became not just a sin but a political threat. The Witchcraft Act of 1604 made it a capital offence to invoke evil spirits or cause harm through supernatural means. It sounds like folklore, but it became law. And, like most laws rooted in fear, it found its victims quickly. Throughout James's reign, local magistrates, under pressure to prove their loyalty, carried out trials with increasing fervour. Women, mostly poor, often widowed, and usually socially inconvenient, were the easiest targets. Their accusers were neighbours, clergy, even family members. A mole on the skin became proof of a witch's mark, a misunderstood illness became evidence of a curse, and a bad harvest could mean the devil had walked through the village in skirts. Though James eventually distanced himself from the more fanatical witch hunters later in his reign, the cultural damage had already been done. His book Daemonology circulated widely and legitimized the belief that witches were not only real, but actionable threats to the realm. It became a handbook for suspicion, a license for moral panic. James's legacy is thus curiously bifurcated. On one hand, he commissioned the King James Bible, perhaps the most beautiful translation of scripture in English history. On the other, he created an atmosphere where people could be condemned for having a cat and an opinion. He died in 1625, leaving behind a nation more literate, more unified under the crown, and more terrified of its neighbours. He had translated the divine right of kings into both scripture and superstition, making himself both God's anointed and the devil's most paranoid enemy. And then came his son, Charles I, a man who didn't just fear rebellion or witchcraft, but anyone who dared raise their voice. His solution? Mutilation, branding. A lesson in obedience that scarred more than just skin. Charles I's court brutally punished dissenters with mutilation and branding. If James I ruled with paranoia, his son Charles ruled with fragility, disguised as divine authority. Where his father saw devils behind doors, Charles saw traitors in every disagreement. He believed in kingship not as a responsibility, but as a metaphysical truth. He was king because God said so, which meant any form of opposition wasn't just sedition, it was heresy. That's how you get mutilation as policy. During Charles's reign, England saw a sharp rise in the use of corporal punishment for dissenters, especially those who used words instead of weapons. Preachers, pamphleteers, and poets who criticized the monarchy or the Church of England were treated not as critics, but as criminals. Take the case of William Prynne, a Puritan lawyer and writer who published works critical of court culture, particularly the perceived immorality of stage plays and royal extravagance. For this, he was sentenced not only to imprisonment, but to having his ears cut off and his cheeks branded with the letters SL for seditious libeller. He wasn't alone. Other intellectuals faced similar fates, public shaming combined with permanent physical reminders of their disobedience. This wasn't just cruelty for spectacle, it was targeted messaging. A branded face was a walking poster for fear. A mutilated writer couldn't simply be forgotten, they became cautionary tales in flesh. Charles relied heavily on the Star Chamber, a secretive royal court that bypassed standard legal procedures. The chamber became infamous for its arbitrary rulings and harsh punishments, functioning as a blunt instrument for royal vengeance. It was here that many dissenters were sentenced away from public scrutiny, beyond appeal, and often without legal representation. And yet, these punishments didn't silence dissent. They amplified it. Branded men became martyrs, pamphlets multiplied, sermons grew bolder. The public began to whisper, then shout that the king had confused his throne for a mirror and expected only his own reflection in return. Eventually, those whispers turned into revolution. Civil war erupted. Charles was captured, tried, and unthinkably executed by his own people. The divine right of kings was buried alongside his head. But before his downfall, Charles left his mark not just on his enemies, but on the country itself. He showed that authoritarianism doesn't need armies. Sometimes it only needs a court, a knife, and a belief that God will forgive anything done in his name. And his son, Charles II, would return to the throne years later, not wiser, not humbler, but with a lesson learned. Brutality works best when it's hidden behind closed doors, or in this case, behind locked plague houses. Charles II kept plague victims locked inside their homes to die during the 1665 outbreak. Charles II is often remembered as the Merry Monarch. He reopened theatres, encouraged science, and brought a touch of style to a monarchy that had been through civil war, regicide, and puritanical gloom. With his flowing wigs and endless mistresses, he seemed to represent a return to fun, if your definition of fun included ignoring Parliament and evading responsibility. But behind the charm and powdered cheekbones was a cold practicality, and during the Great Plague of 1665, that practicality turned into something far darker. The plague, which killed an estimated 100,000 Londoners in under 2 years, exposed not just the fragility of the body, but the callousness of the crown. Charles, for all his wit and flair, didn't exactly roll up his sleeves when the disease hit. In fact, he rolled up his royal carpets, packed his court, and left London altogether. He relocated to Oxford, far from the rats, fleas, and the stench of mass suffering. It wasn't cowardice, it was protocol. Monarchs don't die with commoners. What remained behind in London was a city under quasi-military lockdown. Infected households were sealed shut, often with entire families still inside. Red crosses were painted on their doors, along with the ominous phrase, "Lord, have mercy upon us." Government orders instructed that no one was to enter or exit these homes for 40 days. Guards were stationed outside. Food was delivered sporadically. Windows were nailed shut. In theory, it was quarantine. In practice, it was containment by abandonment. Some historians argue it was necessary. That containment slowed the spread. That drastic times required drastic measures. But the moral cost is harder to calculate. Many who were locked inside were never confirmed to be infected. Others had no symptoms at all. Some simply lived in the wrong household at the wrong time. And once the doors were sealed, there were few second chances. This policy, backed by royal authority and carried out by local officials, turned London into a maze of silent houses and boarded windows. The poor suffered most, as they always do in pandemics. Those who could afford to flee did. Those who couldn't were told to stay put and hope that the air, the judgment of neighbours, or divine will didn't turn against them. And Charles? He returned after the worst had passed. No apology, no great national reflection, just a city forever altered and a king who remained untouched. He brought with him the Great Fire of London the following year, a different kind of disaster, one that conveniently burned away much of the plague-stricken city. But the pattern was clear. In moments of national crisis, the monarchy's instinct wasn't to protect. It was to isolate itself physically, emotionally, politically, from the very people it claimed to serve. And his successor, Queen Anne, inherited not just the throne, but the moral evasions that came with it. She, too, would find herself facing rebellion. But instead of isolation, she chose punishment, methodical, merciless, and done in full view of the crowd. Queen Anne presided over brutal punishments for Jacobite rebels. Queen Anne doesn't get much fanfare. Sandwiched between the restoration drama of the Stuarts and the rational polish of the Georgians, she's often reduced to a woman with too many pregnancies and not enough surviving heirs. But behind the tragic footnotes of her personal life was a reign steeped in quiet ruthlessness, particularly when it came to those who questioned her legitimacy. Enter the Jacobites. Supporters of the deposed James II and his descendants, the Jacobites believed that Anne and the entire Protestant line of succession was illegitimate. They saw the Glorious Revolution not as a victory for religious freedom, but as a theft. And though Anne sat on the throne with relative calm for much of her reign, rebellion was never far off. Especially in Scotland, where loyalty to the exiled Stuarts simmered just beneath the surface. When the first major Jacobite uprising emerged in 1708, Anne's response was swift and unsentimental. Though the rebellion itself was poorly coordinated and ultimately failed to gain traction, the crackdown that followed was anything but mild. Suspected Jacobites were arrested en masse, lands were seized, titles stripped, executions were carried out not just to eliminate threats, but to make examples. What made Anne's retribution notable was its administrative polish. This wasn't the raw, unpredictable violence of earlier monarchs. This was punishment by the book, legalized vengeance with the seal of state. Trials were held, confessions extracted, sentences carried out with theatrical finality. The goal wasn't just to end the Jacobite cause, it was to humiliate it. In some cases, entire families were punished for the actions of one rebellious member. Children lost their inheritances. Wives were turned out of homes. Clans that had existed for centuries found themselves dismantled in a matter of months. The crown had learned a new trick. You don't just kill a rebel, you erase their legacy. Anne justified these measures as necessary to preserve unity and peace. But peace, in this context, was defined as obedience, and unity meant silence. It was during her reign that the union between England and Scotland was formalised in 1707, creating Great Britain, a grand act of political integration or a calculated manoeuvre to dilute resistance. Depends on which side of the sword you're standing. Anne died in 1714, her body broken by illness. Her lineage ended. She left no surviving heirs, and her death marked the beginning of the Hanoverian era. But the blueprint for dealing with rebellion, systematic punishment, economic disenfranchisement, public humiliation was very much intact. And so, when the next king came to power, he brought with him a royal family fractured by resentment, haunted by ghosts, and perfectly willing to lock away those who made too much noise, even if one of them was his own wife. George I locked his wife, Sophia Dorothea, in a castle for 30 years until her death. George, I didn't speak English, didn't particularly like England, and barely bothered to hide his disdain for the role he had inherited. Yet he was crowned king in 1714, the first of the Hanoverian line, brought in to secure a Protestant succession. His rule was administrative, distant, and quietly authoritarian. But the most revealing act of his character came long before his coronation, when he locked away his wife for the rest of her life. Sophia Dorothea of Celle was his cousin, his wife, and eventually his political inconvenience. Their marriage had been arranged for dynastic convenience, standard procedure in royal matchmaking, but it was a disaster from the start. George was cold, controlling, and indifferent. Sophia, spirited and increasingly isolated, sought comfort elsewhere. Rumours swirled of a romantic relationship with Count Philip Christoph von Königsmarck, a Swedish nobleman whose presence at court raised both eyebrows and alarms. In 1694, Königsmarck disappeared. No trial, no farewell, just gone vanished into history like a bad rumour scrubbed clean. Not long after, Sophia Dorothea was accused of infidelity and imprisoned in the castle of Alden. She wasn't tried or sentenced in a court. She was simply removed from society, from family, from her own life, and there she stayed for 30 years. Her imprisonment was not harsh in the traditional sense. She lived in relative comfort, with a small household and access to books and gardens. But she was forbidden contact with her children, barred from court, and erased from public life. Her name was rarely spoken, her existence politely ignored. George remarried only in secret, preferring not to acknowledge the wife he had sidelined like a political liability. Even after ascending to the British throne, George I never revisited the decision. Sophia remained locked away until her death in 1726. Her letters unanswered, her story unresolved. No apology, no revision. Her crime? Disobedience, not of the law, but of expectations. She refused to play the role of silent wife to an unloving husband in a joyless marriage arranged for political convenience. And in a monarchy built on image, even silent rebellion was intolerable. George's reign would be marked by political delegation. He let ministers run the country while he focused on his Hanoverian estates. But his personal decision to lock away his wife reveals a man who governed not with mercy, but with erasure. It would not be the last time the British royal family used confinement as a solution. In fact, it would become a recurring theme. The next king, George II, took this ethos a step further, meeting rebellion not with silence, but with public vengeance, and the results were far messier. George II ordered public executions of Jacobite supporters, many drawn and quartered. George II didn't have the charisma of his father, nor the patience of his ministers. But what he did have, almost to a fault, was a deep-seated fear of rebellion. And for good reason. In 1745, Charles Edward Stuart, known to history as Bonnie Prince Charlie, led the second major Jacobite uprising in an attempt to reclaim the British throne for his exiled Catholic family. The Jacobite cause, long thought dead, suddenly surged back to life with Highlanders marching into England and London, holding its breath. For a moment, it looked like the past might devour the present. But the uprising was crushed at the Battle of Culloden in 1746. It was swift, brutal, and final. What followed, however, wasn't merely the end of a rebellion, it was a deliberate unraveling of an entire culture. Under the orders of George II's government, Jacobite prisoners, many of whom were poorly armed farmers, tenants, and teenagers, were rounded up by the thousands. And unlike previous generations who sometimes opted for mercy after victory, George II went for spectacle. Public trials, public executions, public dismantling of an enemy ideology. Hundreds were sentenced to death. Many were hanged. The higher-profile figures, noblemen and commanders, were given the kind of punishments reserved for traitors, public executions in city centres, often accompanied by speeches and printed pamphlets justifying the verdicts. It wasn't justice, it was theatre. To the Crown, this was more than retaliation, it was branding. A psychological operation to sear into the national consciousness the idea that rebellion was not just futile, but publicly humiliating. The Jacobite movement wasn't just defeated on the battlefield, it was dismantled in town squares, in poems, in policy. Even more telling was the treatment of Scottish Highland culture. The Disarming Act, the Dress Act, clan lands confiscated, tartans banned. The bagpipes, once a symbol of heritage, reclassified as a weapon of war. These weren't simply wartime measures, they were identity erasures. If the people couldn't be trusted to remain loyal, then their very way of life had to be rewritten. George II remained physically distant from much of this. He ruled from London, far from the moors and hills where the Jacobite dream had finally died. But his seal was on every act of suppression, his signature, every law of cultural strangulation. Historians often focus on his military achievements and his conflicts with Parliament. But this moment, this cold, precise campaign to eliminate not just an enemy army, but an entire worldview, stands as one of the most calculated domestic crackdowns in royal history. And yet, despite all the brutality, despite the public punishments and legal decrees, rebellion never fully disappeared. It changed shape, changed names, moved underground. Because if history has proven anything, it's that you can punish an idea, but you can't always kill it. Something George II's son would learn when he tried to manage the unmanageable, an empire growing so fast it began to crack from within. George III authorized violent crackdowns on Irish uprisings. To most schoolchildren, George III is the king who lost America, the monarch blamed for taxation without representation, redcoats, and powdered wigs that somehow symbolized tyranny. But to the Irish, George's sins went far deeper and bloodier. Because while the American colonies declared independence with ink and muskets, Ireland faced the full weight of imperial suppression under George's long and increasingly troubled reign. George III's time on the throne saw multiple waves of unrest in Ireland, none more explosive than the 1798 Irish Rebellion. Inspired by the ideals of the American and French revolutions, the United Irishmen, a coalition of Catholics and Protestants, rose up to demand independence, or at least substantial reform. Their goals were ambitious: an end to British dominance, religious equality, and national self-governance. What they received was brutal suppression. George III, though not physically present in the battlefield decisions, fully backed the government response, a combination of martial law, mass arrests, and a campaign of terror designed to break the back of the uprising. British forces, aided by loyalist militias, were given near limitless power to conduct raids, detain suspects, and exact retribution. Entire communities were treated as complicit. Civilians were swept up in mass punishments. The difference between rebel and resident often blurred at the point of a bayonet. The violence of the 1798 rebellion wasn't just a military failure, it was a moral unraveling. Both sides committed atrocities, but only one claimed to represent law and order. And when order is restored through scorched policy and selective justice, what remains is not peace but silence born from exhaustion. George III's reaction to the rebellion was telling. He did not respond with reflection or reform. Instead, he doubled down on control. In 1801, he oversaw the Act of Union, legally binding Ireland to Great Britain. It was pitched as unity. In practice, it was containment. The king resisted Catholic emancipation, blocking attempts to allow Irish Catholics full political rights. He argued it violated his coronation oath to uphold Protestantism. This wasn't just constitutional posturing, it was an entrenched belief that religion and loyalty were the same thing. Ireland remained under British rule, but never truly at peace. The rebellion had been crushed, but the cause had been planted deeper. And George, who began his reign with optimism and ended it in mental decline, left behind a kingdom more fractured than he found it. He's remembered for his madness, his red coats, his American failure. But for Ireland, his legacy was something colder. Decades of grief papered over with the language of order. And while George grew increasingly unstable in his final years, his policies remained clear-eyed, particularly when it came to profit. Because under multiple monarchs, including him, the British Crown discovered that the most lucrative form of loyalty was slavery. Slavery flourished under royal charters, granted by multiple monarchs, with profits flowing directly to the Crown. Slavery was not a side effect of empire. It was a cornerstone. From the 16th to the 19th centuries, the British monarchy was deeply, structurally complicit in the transatlantic slave trade. This wasn't passive involvement. It wasn't a case of monarchs turning a blind eye to private profiteers. It was official policy. Royal charters, royal patronage, royal profits. Monarchs granted licenses and monopolies to trading companies that trafficked human beings. Chief among them was the Royal African Company, established in the 1662 under the patronage of the Duke of York, later James II. The company's crest, grotesquely enough, included an elephant and a crown. It was given the authority to trade in gold, silver, and slaves. By the end of its operations, it had transported over 100,000 African people, many to British colonies in the Caribbean and the Americas. The monarchy wasn't simply aware. It was invested. Profits flowed directly into royal treasuries. Shares were held by aristocrats and royals alike. The enslaved were catalogued as cargo. their deaths written off as business losses. Subsequent monarchs, including George III, benefited from this infrastructure. Even as public sentiment began to shift in the late 18th century, the crown remained entangled in its financial rewards. The abolition movement faced resistance not just from merchants, but from those who feared that ending slavery meant cutting into royal wealth. And when slavery was finally abolished across the empire in the 1830 seconds, the British government paid compensation not to the formerly enslaved, but to the slave owners. Over £20 million was distributed, including to members of the royal family. The enslaved received nothing but legal freedom, handed to them by the same system that had profited from their bondage. The modern royal family has, in recent years, acknowledged this history in soft focus language, deep regret, reflection, dialogue, but the legacy remains. Royal wealth, prestige, and international influence were built in part on the commodification of human life. Palaces were furnished, endowments made, dynasties fortified, all on the backs of people who were never meant to be remembered. This isn't a scandal buried in the past. It's a silence built into the walls. And it forces a question: can a monarchy claim moral authority when its very foundations are rooted in ownership, displacement, and profit? As uncomfortable as that question is, it's only the beginning. Because next came a monarch who didn't just benefit from empire, he inherited its ghosts. And his personal cruelty toward a wife, a courtroom, and a nation would be far less metaphorical. George IV mistreated his wife, Caroline of Brunswick, publicly humiliating her during their marriage and trial. George IV is what happens when inherited power meets unchecked indulgence. Even during his years as Prince Regent, before he officially took the throne in 1820, he had already made a name for himself, not through leadership or reform, but through lavish spending, scandal, and an almost theatrical distaste for anything resembling restraint. And nowhere did that disdain for decency play out more vividly than in his treatment of his wife, Caroline of Brunswick. Their marriage was doomed from the start. George agreed to marry Caroline in exchange for Parliament settling some of his monumental debts, classic royal trade, wife for solvency. The two met for the first time just days before the wedding. By most accounts, George was repulsed, and Caroline not especially impressed either. He got drunk at the ceremony. She got pregnant shortly after. And from that point on, the two barely shared the same residence, let alone affection. But estrangement wasn't enough for George. He didn't just want to be rid of Caroline, he wanted her ruined. After years apart, Caroline returned to England in 1820 to claim her rightful place as queen. George, now king, refused to allow it. Instead, he launched a full-scale public campaign to deny her the title, dragging his own wife through a trial in the House of Lords known as the Pains and Penalties Bill. The goal? To prove she had committed adultery, thereby invalidating her claim. The proceedings were humiliating. Caroline was painted in lurid detail by witnesses, many of whom had been paid or pressured into testifying. The evidence was thin, contradictory, and often absurd. Still, George pressed on, determined to strip her of rank and dignity. But public sympathy swung toward Caroline. The people saw a king obsessed with vengeance and a woman refusing to be erased. Crowds cheered for her in the streets. Protests erupted. The monarchy, already wobbling under the weight of George's unpopularity, found itself facing a public relations disaster. The bill was eventually dropped, not out of mercy, but because it became politically untenable. George was forced to watch as Caroline was unofficially crowned in the court of public opinion, even if she was denied entrance to Westminster Abbey during his actual coronation. Caroline died the following year, still isolated, still slandered, still denied her place beside the man who had once promised her a throne. George continued his reign, retreating further into excess and ego. Rarely seen, rarely loved. Their story is often told as farce, a tragicomedy of mismatched royals. But beneath the gossip is something sharper, a monarchy that treated women, especially inconvenient ones, as disposable accessories, and a king who used the full weight of state machinery to settle personal grudges. Still, if Caroline's trial exposed the monarchy's pettiness, the reign of George's mother-in-law, Queen Victoria, would reveal something far worse: how cruelty could be scaled into empire, and how famine could be managed like policy. Queen Victoria's empire oversaw famines in Ireland and India, with millions dead while exports continued to Britain. Queen Victoria is the face of an era named after her. A time of industrial expansion, scientific progress, and global empire. Her silhouette appeared on stamps, coins, and monuments from the Caribbean to Calcutta. She was the matriarch of monarchs, a living symbol of British power and Victorian virtue. But behind the portraits and the polite sorrow of widowhood was a reign defined by something much more unsettling: the management of human suffering at imperial scale. Nowhere was this more apparent than in Ireland and India. During the Great Famine in Ireland, 1845-1852, over 1 million people died of starvation and disease. Another 1 million fled the country, many in coffin ships that became floating tombs. The cause? A potato blight. But the deeper truth was systemic. Ireland was a colony in all but name, and the British response to the famine was a calculated mixture of negligence, ideology, and economic coldness. Even as the Irish starved, exports of food grain, livestock, butter continued to flow from Irish ports to English markets. The logic was pure Victorian economics. Free trade must be maintained. The market would sort itself. Charity, they argued, would breed laziness. Victoria herself gave £2,000 to famine relief. That same year, she spent a similar amount on a single piano. In India, the story repeated with chilling familiarity. The famines of the late 19th century, especially the Great Famine of 1876-78, resulted in millions of deaths. Estimates range from 5 to 10 million. These weren't sudden acts of nature. They were exacerbated by colonial policies, high taxation, forced cash crop production, and a refusal to suspend grain exports during crisis. Viceroys and colonial administrators often spoke in the language of providence, framing famine as an unfortunate but natural event. But the policies were deliberate. Relief efforts were underfunded and conditional. Starving Indians were required to work for food, breaking rocks, or building roads for wages that couldn't sustain life. Victoria, once again, remained distant. Her court spoke of sorrow, of prayers, of the burden of empire, but the system did not change. It rewarded extraction, not compassion. It functioned precisely because it could count bodies without hearing voices. The crown profited. Landowners expanded. Railroads were laid across territories soaked in hunger. And through it all, Victoria became more revered, more godlike. A woman hailed as Empress of India, even as India's people withered under her government's policies. This isn't about whether Victoria ordered famine. It's about what was tolerated, what was funded, what was excused. And while her statues still stand across former colonies, the shadow they cast is longer than most care to admit. Because famine under empire isn't just tragedy, it's logistics, it's numbers, and behind those numbers were policies signed in royal name. Policies that would extend beyond famine into other colonial crimes, crimes committed with rifles, flags, and silence. British soldiers under Victoria committed massacres in colonial wars, such as in Amritsar and Africa. When Queen Victoria became Empress of India in 1876, it wasn't just a title, it was a declaration. The British Empire had moved from mercantile ambition to military administration, from influence to occupation. And with it came the inevitable: resistance, rebellion, the cry for sovereignty from people who had never consented to British rule. The empire responded with policies. And when those failed, it responded with bullets. Across Africa, India, and other colonized regions, the British Army under Victoria's reign committed acts that modern historians are still debating how to label. At best, they were war crimes. At worst, they were massacres. And nearly all of them were sanctioned by royal authority, implicitly or explicitly. In 1857, the Indian rebellion called the Sepoy Mutiny in British textbooks shook the empire. The response was swift and merciless. Entire villages were destroyed. Rebels and civilians alike were subjected to collective punishment. The British press justified it as restoring order. Victoria's letters spoke of divine justice. But justice, in this case, came from artillery. In Africa, similar scenes played out. During campaigns in places like the Ashanti Kingdom, modern Ghana, and the Zulu Wars, British troops engaged in aggressive, often preemptive strikes that devastated local populations. Towns were razed. Cultural treasures looted. Resistance met with disproportionate force. Perhaps the most notorious event often associated with Victoria's empire, though it occurred shortly after her death, was the 1919 Amritsar massacre. British troops opened fire on a peaceful gathering of Indians in a walled garden, killing hundreds. While Victoria wasn't alive to witness it, the system that made it possible, the military control, the racial hierarchies, the legal immunity for colonial officers, was one she had presided over and celebrated. These were not isolated incidents. They were part of a broader imperial doctrine: control through fear and punishment as pedagogy. The colonies were taught obedience through military spectacle, through shock and awe long before the phrase existed. And yet, in Britain, Victoria remained an icon of decency, a grieving widow, a pious queen. Her public image was so carefully curated that it rarely overlapped with the reality of her empire. The distance between Balmoral Castle and the battlefields of Africa or the blood-soaked fields of India was more than geographical. It was moral. The British public, fed a steady diet of imperial pride and civilizing mission rhetoric, largely accepted the narrative that these conquests were for the good of the natives. That discipline was unfortunate but necessary. That the Queen was mother to an empire of children. But real history remembers something different. It remembers the villages erased from maps, the names never recorded, the wounds never healed, and the wealth? It kept flowing, especially to the palace, where even silence had a price, and someone, somewhere, was always made to pay it. The royals directly benefited from the opium trade in China. To understand how the British monarchy profited from the drug trade, you have to strip away the polite language of commerce and look at what the empire actually was: a series of aggressive economic experiments enforced by gunboats. And nowhere did that dynamic play out more starkly than in China during the 19th century, when British merchants, backed by royal charters and naval muscle, turned addiction into policy. At the heart of this operation was opium. The British East India Company, an institution so entangled with the crown it might as well have been a royal extension, had a problem. Britain imported massive quantities of tea from China, which the Chinese insisted be paid for in silver. Britain was running out of silver. So they found a workaround. Sell opium, grown in British-controlled India, to the Chinese. Get them addicted. Use the profits to buy tea. Repeat. The Chinese government resisted. It outlawed the trade, destroyed stockpiles, appealed to morality. Britain responded with war. The First Opium War, 1839-1842, ended with China being forced to sign the Treaty of Nanking, ceding Hong Kong to Britain and opening up ports to British merchants. The Second Opium War, 1856-1860, cemented this arrangement even further. These weren't just military victories. They were commercial conquests negotiated at gunpoint. And while the East India Company was the front, the monarchy was always backstage. Queen Victoria received correspondence about the wars. Royal advisors had deep financial stakes. The Crown was the ultimate benefactor of an economic system built on forced dependency. The British public enjoyed cheaper tea and silks. The monarchy's coffers swelled. And across the ocean, an entire society was systematically hollowed out by addiction. This isn't speculation, it's economic reality. The Crown, through its partnerships and protections, profited directly from the infrastructure of the opium trade. It blessed the treaties. It decorated the generals. It accepted the spoils. There's a strange silence in British royal history about the Opium Wars. They're rarely discussed in schools. The royal role is brushed aside as if it were distant or passive. But the truth is that empire under Victoria's reign wasn't just about flags and maps, it was about trade routes lubricated by suffering. The Chinese people paid the cost, first in health, then in sovereignty. Entire generations were impacted. National pride was broken. And also Britain, and by extension, the royal family, could balance its books and sip its tea. This was not a side venture. It was a cornerstone of 19th century imperial finance. And the monarchy, as usual, found a way to remain ceremonially innocent while materially complicit. But if you thought addiction was something exported by empire, consider what the royal family did to those who were too vulnerable to be seen members of their own blood, quietly locked away when their minds or bodies didn't match the image of power. Victoria had her mentally ill relatives locked away. Prince Albert, Victor's epileptic cousin, was hidden for life. In an empire obsessed with appearances, the royal family had one cardinal rule: never look weak. And under Queen Victoria, that obsession turned pathological, especially when it came to family members whose very existence threatened the illusion of a perfect bloodline. Among the more disturbing examples was the fate of Victoria's extended relatives, including Prince Albert Victor's cousin, Prince John of Gloucester, who reportedly suffered from epilepsy and developmental disabilities. But official records barely mention him. Why? Because from a young age, he was quietly removed from public life, institutionalized, and effectively erased. This was not an isolated case. The British royal family had a long-standing tradition of hiding away mentally ill or disabled relatives. Institutions, country homes, and discreet care facilities were used not for treatment, but for concealment. Out of sight, out of history. In the case of Victoria's family, these acts of erasure were doubly ironic. On one hand, the Queen presented herself as the loving matriarch of a sprawling, interconnected royal web mother of Europe, grandmother to emperors. On the other hand, anyone in that web who didn't fit the image of royal excellence was quietly clipped from the frame. What's most unsettling is the casualness of it. These weren't enemies. These were children, cousins, siblings, people born into a family that demanded perfection at any cost. And when perfection wasn't possible, the response wasn't care, it was disappearance. Historians have often excused this behaviour as being, of the time, a reflection of Victorian attitudes toward mental health. But the lengths to which the royals went to scrub their own records go beyond cultural norms. They weren't just isolating relatives. They were altering documents, falsifying death dates, and ensuring that the public never even knew these people existed. In 1987, yes, the late 20th century, the existence of several royal cousins who had been institutionalized in the 1942 came to light. Official records had listed them as dead. In reality, they had lived for decades in mental health facilities. This secrecy persisted for nearly half a century. The lie was inherited as easily as a crown. Victoria set the precedent. Her reign normalized the idea that image was more important than truth, that bloodlines must be polished, not protected, and that silence was always safer than compassion. So while Britain paraded its royal family as symbols of unity, strength, and tradition, it buried its weakest members under layers of secrecy, and that pattern of erasure as strategy didn't stop with health. It extended to labour, to poverty, to factories filled with children, because the monarchy didn't just hide its inconvenient kin. It also delayed justice for an entire generation of exploited workers so long as the gears of empire kept turning. She supported child labour and delayed reform for factory workers. The Victorian age is often sold as a story of progress. Railways, medicine, education, democracy. But underneath the industrial grandeur was a very different story, a country powered by the backs of children and a monarchy more concerned with royal christenings than factory floors. Queen Victoria's reign coincided with the peak of Britain's industrial expansion, when factories became the new cathedrals and profit the new scripture. Children were swept into this revolution as ideal workers, small, cheap, and expendable. They crawled under looms, hauled coal, cleaned chimneys. 12-hour shifts were common. So were injuries, illness, and exhaustion. And while reformers rang alarm bells, the Crown remained pointedly silent. Victoria, despite being hailed as the moral compass of her time, showed little urgency in addressing child labour. Her government, often composed of aristocrats who owned the very factories in question, resisted regulations that would threaten profit margins. Every attempt at labour reform was a drawn-out political fight, met with royal indifference or passive approval. She expressed sympathy occasionally. Letters mentioned concern for the poor, especially in the abstract. But concern without action is just branding. And in Victoria's case, the monarchy's real interest was in maintaining the appearance of a well-ordered empire, not in dismantling the systems that kept it running. Even as reports of child exploitation reached Parliament, reforms were slow and shallow. The Factory Acts, which gradually introduced regulations, were riddled with loopholes. Enforcement was minimal, and the royal family never once led the charge for better conditions. They attended galas, they unveiled statues, they knighted industrialists, but they never visited the slums that powered their empire. The irony is rich. Victoria, celebrated as the embodiment of domestic virtue and family values, oversaw an era where tens of thousands of children were denied childhoods so that others could sip tea and marvel at imperial exports. And while she had 9 children of her own, each wrapped in royal linen and educated in palaces, the children of the working class were buried in soot and silence. Her defenders argue that social reform eventually came, but reform delayed is protection denied, and Victoria, with all her influence, chose legacy over empathy. She built monuments, not safety nets. The factories were never far from the palace, and the cries of child labourers never quite reached the throne, not because they were too faint, but because they were inconvenient. That moral convenience would resurface again in her descendants, especially in a king who admired the efficient, orderly cruelty of another empire. A man who saw authoritarianism not as a warning, but as a model. Edward VIII admired Adolf Hitler and visited him in 1937. By the time Edward VIII was crowned King of the United Kingdom in 1936, he had already mastered the art of disinterest. Aloof, vain, and chronically allergic to responsibility, Edward saw monarchy not as a sacred duty, but as a lifestyle brand, a curated identity made up of parties, yachts, and photo ops. But what truly made his reign infamous wasn't its brevity or his abdication for love, it was his apparent admiration for fascism, specifically Adolf Hitler. In 1937, less than a year after stepping down from the throne to marry Wallis Simpson, Edward and his new wife embarked on a highly controversial visit to Nazi Germany. It was a private trip, not sanctioned by the British government, and it raised eyebrows even before it began. But what occurred during the visit turned skepticism into scandal. Edward and Wallis were treated like royalty not just because they once were, but because the Nazi regime saw immense propaganda value in presenting them as sympathizers. They were photographed inspecting SS troops, meeting Nazi officials, and most notoriously paying a visit to Hitler himself at his mountain retreat, the Berghof. The two men reportedly spoke for over 50 minutes, a private conversation never officially disclosed, but long enough to stoke fears that Edward may have harboured more than just curiosity. The British royal establishment scrambled to distance itself. Edward's defenders claimed he was simply naive, manipulated by German hospitality and unaware of the optics, but intelligence reports suggested otherwise. British and American surveillance at the time painted a darker picture, that Edward not only admired Hitler's strength and discipline, but saw fascism as a bulwark against communism and social upheaval. For a man obsessed with order and privilege, Nazi Germany may have looked, alarmingly, like a well-oiled machine. Even Winston Churchill, no stranger to imperial hardlining, expressed concern over Edward's loyalties. During World War II, Edward was appointed Governor of the Bahamas, a tropical exile with minimal political significance. The Crown's message was clear. He could be managed, but not trusted. In the post-war years, Edward's Nazi associations were quietly buried. Official biographies tiptoed around the 1,937 trip. The royal family maintained a studied silence. But archival material, particularly the now declassified Marburg files, reveals that Edward's links to the Nazi regime were more than just tabloid fodder. They were a genuine concern to Allied intelligence. He wasn't just a royal flirt with authoritarianism. He was a former king whose ideological leanings placed him on the wrong side of the 20th century's defining battle. And as it turns out, admiration wasn't the full extent of it. Because there are credible suggestions that Edward didn't just pose for photos with fascists, he may have handed them British secrets too. Edward VIII allegedly shared British military secrets with the Nazis. The line between carelessness and conspiracy is thin, especially when the person towing it is a former King of England, recently dethroned, famously bitter, and suddenly chummy with Europe's most dangerous regime. That was the question hanging over Edward VIII after his 1937 visit to Germany. Did he simply admire Hitler's efficiency, or did he actively pass along British intelligence to the enemy? Declassified files and diplomatic cables point toward the latter, at least, in part. The so-called Marburg files, unearthed after World War II and kept under wraps for years, contain intercepted German communications that paint Edward as more than a casual tourist. According to these reports, Nazi officials believed they could manipulate the former king into acting as a sympathizer, possibly even reinstating him as a puppet monarch in the event of a successful German invasion of Britain. They referred to him in code, they courted him with flattery, and most worryingly, they believed he was open to negotiation. Edward's defenders insist he was simply naive, that he never meant to betray his country, that he spoke out of turn but never acted with malice. But according to several diplomatic correspondences, Edward allegedly shared information about French military defences with the Germans, passed through intermediaries. If true, this wasn't just a social blunder, it was a direct breach of national security. At the time, France was still a key British ally, and any leaks regarding their fortifications, especially the vulnerabilities of the Maginot Line, could have devastating consequences. While it's unclear exactly what was shared, the implication is clear. Edward, perhaps bitter about his abdication and feeling sidelined by his family and country, may have let his grievances guide his judgment. This wasn't a man operating in a vacuum. He was part of a wider elite European network that, during the 1930 seconds, was not uniformly anti-fascist. Many aristocrats, business leaders, and politicians saw Hitler as a stabilizing force, a barrier against Bolshevism and social unrest. Edward's views, while disturbing in hindsight, were not wholly unique. What made them dangerous was his platform and his proximity to the throne. The British royal family moved quickly to contain the damage. Edward's role during World War II was minimal. His public statements were tightly controlled. The Bahamas posting served two purposes. It was both a face-saving gesture and a quarantine. To this day, the full extent of Edward's wartime sympathies remains cloudy. Official channels prefer ambiguity. The royal narrative emphasizes love over politics, romance over treason. But for intelligence historians, Edward VIII remains one of the most uncomfortable what-ifs in British royal history. What if he had remained king? What if his sympathies had translated into policy? What if the crown had fallen not to revolution, but to seduction? And while Edward dabbled in ideological danger, another royal made a different choice, one that would cost lives not in theory, but in reality. Because when Tsar Nicholas II begged for refuge, the British king turned him away. George V denied asylum to his cousin, Tsar Nicholas II, and his family, leading to their execution. Family, in royal terms, is always political. The relationships between monarchs aren't measured in affection, but in leverage what one crown can offer another, and at what cost. So when Tsar Nicholas II, cousin to George V and the last emperor of Russia, found himself on the wrong side of a revolution, he turned not to diplomats or armies, but to blood. He asked for sanctuary, and George said no. The year was 1917. Russia had imploded. The Romanovs had abdicated, and the new provisional government placed Nicholas and his family under house arrest. For a brief moment, there was hope of escape. British Prime Minister David Lloyd George supported a plan to bring the Romanovs to Britain. Arrangements were discussed, ships were considered. It was, for all intents and purposes, a rescue mission. But then, without public explanation, the offer was rescinded. Historians have debated George V's motivations ever since. Officially, the concern was political. Britain was in the middle of World War I, and domestic tensions were high. The monarchy, though secure, was under scrutiny. Hosting a deposed autocrat, especially one associated with brutality, inequality, and military failure, could inflame public opinion. Privately, George feared for his own throne. The Russian Revolution had sent shockwaves through European monarchies. Bringing Nicholas to England risked painting the British royals as sympathetic to a toppled regime. The optics were too dangerous. The crown, it seems, had to protect itself. So the door was closed. The Romanovs were left in limbo, shuttled between prisons. Eventually, in July 1918, they were executed by Bolshevik forces in a basement in Yekaterinburg. The Tsar, the Tsarina, their 5 children, the family that had ruled Russia for over 300 years, was wiped out not just physically, but symbolically. George later expressed regret. Letters reveal a tortured ambivalence, a man caught between personal loyalty and political instinct. But no amount of regret could reverse the decision. The facts remained. He had the power to help. He chose not to. Some argue he had no choice. That Parliament or the War Cabinet forced his hand. But constitutional monarchs, when they want to intervene, often find ways to make things happen. And in this case, George did not. He let silence do the talking. The British royal family maintained friendly ties with the Romanovs for generations. Portraits were shared, letters exchanged, their children played together. But when it mattered, when safety was needed more than ceremony, those ties meant nothing. It's a recurring theme in royal history. When the stakes rise, survival outweighs sentiment. And as the monarchy edged into the modern age, it would encounter more scandals buried in whispers, some so serious the only solution was silence, denial, or decades of avoidance. Like the next story where the crown would be connected, uncomfortably, to a man whose crimes echoed long after his death. Lord Mountbatten, related to the royals, was accused of abuse of children. Allegations surfaced decades later. To the public, Lord Louis Mountbatten was royalty without a crown, a war hero, a statesman, and a favourite uncle to princes. His face appeared on commemorative stamps. He was painted as a mentor to Prince Charles, a bridge between the old empire and the modern monarchy. His death in 1979, at the hands of the IRA, was mourned across the country and marked as a tragic end to a life of distinguished service. But decades after his assassination, a different picture began to emerge, one that traded medals for allegations and shook the legacy of a man long regarded as untouchable. Beginning in the 2010 seconds, historical researchers, journalists, and abuse survivors brought forward claims that Mountbatten had been involved in the sexual exploitation of boys during the 1,970 seconds. The allegations were never tested in court, and Mountbatten was long dead when they surfaced. But their weight lay not just in the accusations themselves, but in the context surrounding them. Rumours that had followed him for years, whispers in political circles, and classified files that were locked, redacted, or lost. In 2019, the Independent Inquiry into Child Sexual Abuse, IICSA, in the UK received testimony from an alleged survivor who claimed that Mountbatten had abused him in a Northern Ireland care home. The institution in question, Conqueror Boys' Home, had long been suspected of being part of a wider network of abuse, one with disturbing links to intelligence services and political elites. Mountbatten's name appeared in multiple intelligence files, albeit obliquely, and with deliberate vagueness. Journalists who tried to investigate the story during the 1,980 seconds and 90 seconds were reportedly warned off. Some government files referencing Mountbatten remained sealed far beyond the usual disclosure period, fueling suspicion that something or someone was being protected. It's important to clarify, Mountbatten was never formally charged. He cannot defend himself. But the consistency of the allegations, their alignment with long-standing rumours, and the apparent reluctance of institutions to fully confront them raise disturbing questions about what is remembered and what is ignored in the service of royal mythology. The monarchy has never commented on the allegations. They have never acknowledged the rumours, never addressed the sealed files, never offered public support for a full investigation, its silence by design. And yet, Mountbatten remains prominently enshrined in royal memory. Statues, naval bases, and ceremonial tributes continue. He's still portrayed in films and television as the wise elder, the trusted guide, the ultimate insider. A narrative untouched by the allegations that now hang like shadows around his legacy. Because if the stories are true or even partly true, then the implications stretch beyond one man. They point to a network of power where accountability was negotiable, truth was malleable, and protection came not from innocence, but from proximity to the throne. And when proximity becomes protection, even darker stories can be buried. Like the next, a royal heir whose name has long been whispered alongside one of history's most infamous killing sprees, and whose disappearance from public life was as sudden as it was convenient. The royals covered up Prince Albert Victor's rumoured ties to scandals, and possibly Jack the Ripper suspicions. Prince Albert Victor, Duke of Clarence and Avondale, was supposed to be king. The eldest son of Edward VII and heir presumptive to the British throne, Albert Victor was born into a lineage of inevitability. And yet, he remains one of the most enigmatic and suspiciously under-discussed figures in royal history. Not because of what he did, but because of what he may have known, or been. The rumours began not long after the Jack the Ripper murders terrorised London in 1888. The killings were grisly, the victims all women, the police baffled, and the public gripped by fear. The mystery of the Ripper's identity became one of the greatest unsolved cases in British history, and among the dozens of theories that emerged, one of the most persistent and politically explosive was the idea that Prince Albert Victor was somehow involved. No credible evidence ever surfaced, no confession, no witness testimony linking him directly, but the whispers never stopped. Some claimed he was the killer. Others said he knew who the killer was. Still others suggested he had been sent abroad during the murders to keep him out of the spotlight, not for a cover-up of guilt, but of scandal. It's worth noting that Albert Victor was dogged by rumours of illicit behaviour for much of his adult life. Allegations tied him to a male brothel in the Cleveland Street scandal, a story that nearly engulfed the monarchy in disgrace. His alleged sexual orientation, though largely irrelevant to modern audiences, was seen at the time as dangerous ammunition. The press kept quiet. The palace, predictably, shut it down. When Albert Victor died suddenly in 1892 at the age of 28, just weeks after his engagement to Princess Mary of Teck, conspiracy theorists had a field day. Was it influenza, as officially reported? Or something more sinister? Poison? Institutionalization? Elimination? Again, no evidence. Just silence. And the palace preferred it that way. His memory was largely sanitized, his name rarely invoked, his potential reign erased from public consciousness. Even his burial site is unusually ornate, almost as if it's compensating for the chaos of his legacy. The royal family has never addressed the Ripper rumours, nor the Cleveland Street scandal in any depth. Official biographies mention Albert Victor only briefly. A tragic young man, a life cut short, a footnote in the path to George V. But the lingering suspicion is hard to shake that the monarchy, terrified of public scandal, buried more than just a prince. They buried a potential scandal so destabilizing it could have reshaped the institution itself. And if hiding scandal became protocol, George VI, the eventual inheritor of the throne, would apply that strategy on a much larger scale, not to one man, but to an entire uprising, with consequences that would leave scars not just on a nation, but on a continent. King George VI enforced brutal colonial crackdowns in Kenya's Mau Mau uprising with torture camps. The myth of George VI is built on stuttering dignity. The reluctant king who led Britain through World War II overcame personal insecurities and restored a sense of honour to a monarchy nearly wrecked by his brother's abdication. He's often framed as the embodiment of quiet strength, a wartime figurehead whose courage inspired a nation. But what rarely enters that portrait is his role as head of an empire still desperately clinging to control, or his monarchy's direct involvement in one of the most disturbing colonial crackdowns of the 20th century, the Mau Mau uprising in Kenya. The Mau Mau Rebellion, which began in the early 1952s, was a resistance movement led primarily by the Kikuyu people against British colonial rule. It wasn't just a call for independence, it was a response to decades of land theft, racial segregation, and political disenfranchisement. But the British didn't treat it as an anti-colonial protest. They labelled it terrorism, and they responded accordingly. During the uprising, the British government, with royal authority, declared a state of emergency in Kenya. Mass arrests followed. Entire villages were uprooted, and tens of thousands of Kenyans were detained in what were euphemistically called detention camps. These were not rehabilitation centres. They were sites of forced labour, systemic abuse, and violent suppression. Survivors spoke decades later of inhumane conditions, coercion, and physical punishments aimed at breaking resistance. King George VI, though increasingly ill and nearing the end of his reign, remained the constitutional head of state. These actions were carried out in his name. His government funded them. His military enforced them. His crown, as always, remained the symbolic justification. To be clear, the king didn't personally oversee these camps, but he didn't denounce them either. There was no royal statement of concern, no expression of regret, just official silence. Policy continued. The empire, shrinking in size but bloated in arrogance, pressed on. When the details of the Mau Mau crackdown began to surface in the 2000s following lawsuits and declassified documents, the British government admitted that abuses had occurred. Compensation was eventually paid to some survivors, but the monarchy never issued a formal apology. Because acknowledging complicity isn't just about history, it's about power. George VI died in 1952. Passing the throne to his daughter, Elizabeth. His image remains largely intact. The wartime king, the family man, the reluctant hero. But for many in Kenya, his legacy is remembered not in speeches or medals, but in barbed wire and silence. And under his daughter's long reign, that silence would persist. Especially when the empire's crimes came closer to home on the streets of Northern Ireland, in the schools of Canada, and in the confidential files locked behind palace doors. Elizabeth II's government suppressed details of the Bloody Sunday massacre in Northern Ireland. For most of her reign, Queen Elizabeth II was praised for her restraint. The monarchy, under her stewardship, learned to thrive in silence, never commenting on politics, never confronting scandal directly, and never apologizing unless absolutely cornered. But silence, as history has shown, is rarely neutral. And during one of the darkest chapters of the United Kingdom's modern history, the Bloody Sunday massacre in Northern Ireland, that silence spoke volumes. On the 30th of January, 1972, British soldiers from the Parachute Regiment opened fire on unarmed civil rights protesters in Derry. 14 civilians were killed. Most were teenagers and young adults. All were unarmed. They had gathered to protest internment without trial. a policy seen by many in the Catholic nationalist community as discriminatory and authoritarian. The response from the British establishment was immediate and defensive. The army claimed they had been fired upon, that the protesters were armed, that the soldiers were simply returning fire. Within days, the government launched the Widgery Tribunal, an official inquiry that largely exonerated the military. Its conclusions were rushed and its methods questionable. It was seen not as an investigation, but a justification. What does this have to do with the Crown? Everything and nothing, depending on how you view constitutional monarchy. Formally, the Queen was not involved in military decisions or political responses. But as head of state, Supreme Governor of the Church of England, and the ceremonial face of the British government, her name and her silence loomed large. The military acted in her name. The soldiers wore her insignia. The government that suppressed the truth reported to her. And yet, there was no royal statement, no public acknowledgement, no visit to Derry. Just the familiar palace strategy. Let the ministers handle it and wait for the storm to pass. The truth did not pass. For decades, families of the victims demanded justice. Their loved ones were branded as threats and terrorists in official records. Meanwhile, the Queen continued to make state visits, attend ceremonies, and shake hands with leaders, all while a generation of Northern Irish citizens saw her as a symbol not of unity, but of denial. It wasn't until 2010, under Prime Minister David Cameron, that a second inquiry, the Saville Report, finally concluded what many had known all along. The killings were unjustified. The victims were innocent. The soldiers had fired first. The Widgery Tribunal had been a whitewash. Cameron apologised. Parliament stood in silence. The Queen did not comment. To some, that restraint was royal decorum. To others, it was a pattern of distancing the monarchy from the violence done in its name, while continuing to benefit from the institutions that carried it out. And the same pattern would appear again, not in the context of war, but of education. Because under Elizabeth's reign, another silent tragedy unfolded not in the streets of Derry, but in the schools of the Commonwealth. And this time, the victims were children. During Elizabeth II's reign, Indigenous children were abused in Commonwealth schools under policies tied to imperial governance. The British Empire may have receded, but its administrative fingerprints were never fully erased. Long after the Union Jack stopped flying over colonial capitals, the machinery of control remained in place, especially in the education systems of Commonwealth countries. And under the reign of Queen Elizabeth II, that machinery continued to operate in ways that left deep scars. One of the most harrowing examples: the abuse and forced assimilation of Indigenous children in residential and boarding schools. In Canada, Australia, and other former British territories, thousands of Indigenous children were taken from their families, sometimes forcibly, and placed in government or church-run schools. These institutions were often funded and managed under laws and systems rooted in imperial policy, with direct ties to British colonial governance. Their goal was explicit: to erase Indigenous languages, cultures, and identities in the name of civilizing native populations. These schools operated under policies that originated during Britain's colonial rule, and many continued well into Elizabeth's reign. Though she did not design the system, her role as head of state gave symbolic legitimacy to the governments and churches that implemented it. Her face was on the currency, her name on the charters, and her title invoked in the oaths of office by the very politicians who oversaw these programs. The abuse, physical, emotional, and cultural, was not a secret. Survivors spoke out for decades. Reports were published. Governments were pressured. And yet, until the late 20th century, there was little formal recognition. No royal inquiry. No visits to affected communities. no apology. In 2021, the discovery of hundreds of unmarked graves at former residential school sites in Canada shocked the world. For many, it was a long overdue validation of what Indigenous communities had been saying for generations. Children had died in these schools, families had been torn apart, cultures had been dismantled. The Queen made no public statement. The silence was defended, once again, as apolitical neutrality. But to those affected, it felt like indifference, as if the crown that once claimed dominion over their ancestors could not now spare a word for their grandchildren. Critics argue that the monarchy should have done more, that Elizabeth II, as sovereign of these nations, could have used her influence to press for reconciliation, to support survivors, to acknowledge the past. Instead, she remained above the fray, floating serenely above the policies carried out in her name. And when apologies did come from governments, churches, and commissions, they came alone. The crown remained untouched, regal, removed. But the truth doesn't stay buried, not in graves, not in sealed documents, and certainly not in history. And while Indigenous children were suffering under imperial policies, the royal household itself remained immune from scrutiny. So immune, in fact, that it could behave badly in public with barely a consequence, especially if the man doing it was the Queen's husband. Prince Philip was accused of making racist comments repeatedly, defended as gaffes. Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, spent more than 7 decades as consort to Queen Elizabeth II, an institution within an institution. His job, nominally, was to support the Queen. In practice, he became the monarchy's unofficial spokesperson for the unspeakable, the off-the-cuff, the undiplomatic, the wildly inappropriate. Throughout his public life, Philip made headlines for remarks that many considered offensive, culturally insensitive, or outright racist. The palace preferred to call them gaffes. The media treated them as quirky, even endearing grandpa jokes from a man of a different era. But to the people at the receiving end of his comments, they were not jokes. They were reminders of who power protects. There was the time he asked an Aboriginal elder in Australia if his people still throw spears. Or the time he warned British students in China that they'd get slitty eyes if they stayed too long. Or the moment he asked a black British politician what part of Africa he was from despite him being born in the UK. These weren't rare slips. They were consistent, predictable, and largely unchallenged. The palace issued no apologies. The crown remained silent. The narrative was curated. Philip was blunt, but harmless. A product of his time. An old-world figure, out of sync with modern sensitivities. And so, each incident was absorbed into the mythology of royal eccentricity. But words have power, especially when they come from a man representing one of the most powerful families in the world. When Philip made these remarks, they were broadcast globally, sanctioned by silence, and cloaked in ceremonial robes. The message they sent, intended or not, was that royalty exists above accountability. Defenders argued that Philip supported diversity in other ways, that he was a patron of multicultural charities, that he worked alongside global leaders of every background. But that's not the point. The issue wasn't what he supported, it was what he got away with. The monarchy's handling of Philip's remarks revealed something deeper, that it was willing to tolerate problematic behavior as long as it didn't threaten the brand. And the brand depended on distance, on being untouchable, on rewriting mistakes as quirks. And yet, even as Philip faded from public life, the consequences of his words lingered. They added fuel to broader criticisms about the monarchy's relationship with race, colonialism, and privilege. And they cast a shadow over its attempts to present itself as modern, inclusive, and progressive. a shadow that would grow even darker when the palace's own practices, financial, political, and legal, began to reveal a very different reality. Because for all the monarchy's speeches about duty and transparency, the next story reveals what happens when the royals aren't just silent, but secretive. The royals' immense wealth was partly hidden in offshore tax havens, shielded from public scrutiny. The British royal family is often described as symbolic, ceremonial, apolitical. But one area where their symbolism tends to fall apart is money. Because beneath the waving, the ribbon cutting, and the public duties, the royals are undeniably extraordinarily rich. And the question that has dogged their wealth for generations is simple. How much exactly do they have? And why are they going to such lengths to make sure the public never finds out? In 2017, the Paradise Papers, a massive leak of financial documents, revealed that the Duchy of Lancaster, the private estate that provides income to the sovereign, had invested millions of pounds in offshore tax havens. This wasn't illegal, but it was a particularly awkward revelation for a family that insists it serves the public good. The leak showed that Queen Elizabeth II had financial ties to shell companies in Bermuda and the Cayman Islands, jurisdictions better known for secrecy and tax avoidance than royal transparency. Defenders of the crown were quick to respond. The Queen had no direct involvement, they said. She trusted her financial advisors. Everything was above board, but the optics were terrible. At a time when austerity was hammering working-class families across the UK, the idea that the monarch, technically exempt from tax laws, was profiting quietly through tax shelters hit a national nerve. And it wasn't just about perception. It raised real questions about oversight. The Duchy of Lancaster and the Duchy of Cornwall, the private estate tied to the Prince of Wales, are both massive land portfolios, generating hundreds of millions in revenue. They enjoy special legal statuses that exempt them from paying corporation tax. They are audited privately. And crucially, their operations are shielded from the kind of public scrutiny expected of any other large financial institution. Over the years, the monarchy has repeatedly resisted efforts to subject its finances to freedom of information laws. Attempts to force greater transparency have been met with legal exemptions, parliamentary lobbying, and a well-honed royal strategy. Do the minimum required and frame it as generosity. When occasional disclosures do occur, annual sovereign grant reports, for example, they present a narrow picture. Public funds are listed, some travel expenses, a few renovation costs, but the true breadth of royal wealth, land, assets, offshore holdings, private investments remains opaque. Supporters argue that the monarchy brings in more than it costs, that tourism, national branding, and stability outweigh the price of palaces. But that argument assumes transparency. It assumes trust. And it assumes the crown isn't quietly benefiting from financial systems designed to hide wealth from public accountability. The British taxpayer continues to fund royal expenses from security to upkeep to ceremonial events. Meanwhile, the royal estates quietly grow, untouched by the tax burdens facing ordinary citizens. It's a monarchy built on mystique, where even the money wears a crown. And money, it turns out, isn't the only thing the royals have kept hidden. Because while the public admired the elegance of Princess Margaret, those closest to her endured something far less regal. Something colder. Something crueler. Princess Margaret's cruelty to servants and friends was infamous, belittling them in public. Princess Margaret, the younger sister, the rebel royal, the glamorous outsider, has often been romanticized as the monarchy's tragic wildcard. She smoked, she drank, she laughed too loud at parties, and wore dresses that made the palace flinch. She was, in short, everything the crown pretended not to be. But behind the glitter and scandal was a reputation far less enchanting, one of sharp-tongued cruelty and an almost performative disdain for those around her. Margaret didn't just live in privilege, she wielded it like a weapon. Stories from former staff, friends, and acquaintances paint a consistent picture. Margaret could be warm, witty, even charming, but only when it suited her. And when it didn't, she made sure everyone in the room knew exactly where they stood, beneath her. Anecdotes of her treatment of servants are particularly telling. According to multiple insiders, she had a habit of belittling staff in front of guests, sometimes mimicking their voices, commenting on their appearances, or correcting them with icy precision. One former butler recalled being summoned from across the estate only to be told he was standing a few inches off mark when pouring her drink. Another described being chastised for placing her toast at the wrong angle. These weren't moments of royal eccentricity, they were acts of dominance. Margaret didn't simply expect service, she expected submission, and she wasn't shy about enforcing the line. Her relationships with friends and romantic partners followed a similar pattern. For all her charm, Margaret was known to lash out publicly at those closest to her. Her long-term companion, Roddy Llewellyn, was often the target of withering sarcasm. Friends described the experience of being in her orbit as thrilling until it wasn't. The same sharp wit that made her the life of the party could just as easily be turned on a guest who wore the wrong outfit or dared to interrupt. And yet, Margaret was rarely challenged. Her royal status protected her. Palace insiders called her behavior difficult or temperamental, euphemisms that rarely would have been extended to anyone else behaving similarly. In many ways, Margaret's cruelty wasn't the exception. It was the concentrated expression of a system that breeds entitlement. She had no real power, but she had proximity to it. And in a monarchy built on hierarchy, that was often enough. Her defenders say she was misunderstood, that she was a woman trapped in an institution that didn't allow her to be anything other than ornamental, that she lashed out because she had no outlet. And perhaps there's truth in that. But even as we empathize with her constraints, we cannot ignore the damage she inflicted on those within reach. Because royalty, at its worst, creates a bubble one where cruelty is tolerated, justified, even admired if it comes dressed in jewels and delivered with a smile. And while Margaret cut people down in salons and drawing rooms, her nephew would eventually cut something else entirely. The illusion of marital fidelity. Not with words, but with a televised confession. Prince Charles admitted to adultery, while still married to Princess Diana. The marriage of Prince Charles and Princess Diana was supposed to be a fairy tale. A virginal bride, a future king, and a nation hungry for spectacle. But within a few years, the fairy dust settled, and the monarchy was left grappling with something far more human. A relationship fractured by coldness, incompatibility, and betrayal. At the center of it all stood Charles, the heir to the throne, whose eventual admission of infidelity would mark one of the most humiliating episodes in modern royal history. By the early 1992, the cracks were no longer private. Diana and Charles had become living metaphors for royal dysfunction, gracing tabloids with stories of arguments, affairs, and icy silences. The public adored Diana. They were more ambivalent about Charles, and when news broke of his long-standing relationship with Camilla Parker Bowles, public sympathy hardened into suspicion. In 1994, Charles finally addressed the rumours head-on in a now infamous television interview with journalist Jonathan Dimbleby. When asked if he had been faithful to Diana, he paused and then answered, "Yes," until it became irretrievably broken. It was a confession delivered in the stiff tones of aristocratic rationalization, but the subtext was clear. The future King of England had cheated on his wife and was now publicly justifying it. For the monarchy, it was a nightmare. Not because of the affair royals have always had those, but because of the transparency. The admission broke a cardinal rule of royal conduct: never explain, never complain. Suddenly, the heir was explaining, and the public was listening. Charles attempted to frame the relationship with Camilla as one of emotional inevitability, that they had been in love for decades, separated by duty, and drawn back together through the failures of their respective marriages. But the damage was done. The narrative had already taken shape. Charles the cold, Diana the wronged. Diana, of course, would deliver her own version a year later in the legendary Panorama interview, where she uttered the now immortal line, "There were 3 of us in this marriage, so it was a bit crowded." The royal family scrambled. Advisors tried to manage the fallout, but what they couldn't manage was the shift in public perception. For the first time in modern memory, a future monarch had become a character in a soap opera of his own making. Charles's admission wasn't just personal, it was institutional. It revealed the monarchy not as a moral compass, but as a deeply flawed family, playing out its dramas under the world's largest spotlight. And if his betrayal was personal, Diana's suffering would soon become political. Because when she tried to speak her truth, the palace didn't just recoil. It turned cold, closed, and quietly punitive. Diana herself revealed the coldness and neglect she faced from the royal household. When Diana Spencer joined the royal family in 1981, she was 20 years old, largely unprepared, and already being dressed as an icon. The fairy tale narrative had been set. She was the shy nursery teacher turned princess, married to the heir to the throne, in a wedding watched by 750 million people worldwide. But from the moment the carriage rolled away from St. Paul's Cathedral, the reality began to unravel. Behind the public smiles and tiaras was a house, the house where empathy was rationed, warmth was conditional, and individuality was treated as an inconvenience. Diana didn't just marry Charles. She married the institution, and the institution didn't know what to do with her. From the start, she was lonely, isolated within Buckingham Palace, given no formal guidance, no mentor, no real support. Royal protocol operated like a cold, unwritten language, intelligible only to those born into it. Diana, though aristocratic, was still an outsider, and the royal family, particularly the senior courtiers, seemed more concerned with containment than with compassion. In her own words, later shared in interviews, secret recordings, and Andrew Morton's 1992 biography, Diana, her true story, she described a life of emotional neglect. She spoke of crying alone in her room, of feeling unwanted, of being treated like a liability the moment she showed signs of independence. Her popularity became a threat. Her media magnetism, once seen as an asset, quickly became a problem. The institution preferred shadows. Diana brought light, and light reveals everything. She was branded difficult, unstable, too emotional. Code words used by bureaucracies to discredit women who refused to play quietly. The royal family, bound by its own myth of emotional restraint, couldn't or wouldn't respond to her distress with humanity. Instead, they closed ranks. Diana wasn't silenced, exactly, but she was certainly frozen out. As her marriage deteriorated alongside the increasingly public affair between Charles and Camilla, Diana sought agency the only way she could, by speaking out. Her interviews weren't just tabloid fodder. They were acts of defiance against an institution that expected her to suffer quietly for the sake of image. When she spoke about her struggles with mental health, her feelings of abandonment, and her desire to be more than just a royal ornament, she wasn't just telling her story. She was pulling the curtain back on the system, and it terrified them. The monarchy had always weathered scandals, affairs, financial questions, even abdications, but Diana posed a different kind of threat. She was beloved. The public sided with her. She spoke the language of vulnerability in a family trained to suppress it. And as the gap between her honesty and the monarchy's silence widened, the public began to wonder if this was how they treated one of their own. What did it say about the rest of the institution? Even after her separation from Charles, the palace tried to maintain control, managing her schedule, stripping her of titles, and limiting her access to official events. But Diana had already rewritten the rules, and the public followed. Still, nothing could prepare the world for what came next, because when she died, the real mask of the monarchy slipped, and the people saw what grief looked like when loyalty and image went to war. The monarchy attempted to suppress open discussion of Diana's death and criticized public grief. On the 31st of August, 1997, the world stopped. Princess Diana, newly divorced, hounded by paparazzi, and still the most beloved member of the royal family, died in a car crash in Paris. The news ricocheted around the globe. Candlelight vigils erupted outside Buckingham Palace within hours. Tributes poured in from presidents, prime ministers, and millions of ordinary people who felt they had lost someone they actually knew. And yet, amid the global mourning, one voice was conspicuously absent: the monarchy's. For nearly a week, Queen Elizabeth II and the royal family remained at Balmoral Castle in Scotland. There were no public statements, no televised addresses, no Union Jack at half-mast over Buckingham Palace. In a moment when the country cried out for leadership, the crown appeared cold, distant, unmoved. The same institution that had stage-managed weddings, christenings, and jubilees with meticulous precision suddenly went mute at the most human moment imaginable. The public noticed. Crowds outside the palace grew larger and angrier. Newspapers ran editorials questioning the Queen's silence. Commentators began asking whether the monarchy had miscalculated so badly that it might not recover. For the first time in modern memory, the royal family's emotional detachment wasn't interpreted as stoicism. It was seen as disdain. Behind the scenes, palace advisors were panicking. The Queen, reportedly believing it was more important to protect her grandchildren, William and Harry, from the media storm, stayed in Scotland. But the optics were disastrous. What was meant as a private act of care came across as public indifference. When the Queen finally addressed the nation 5 days later, the damage had already been done. The speech, while carefully worded, felt belated. The crowd outside the palace softened, but the suspicion lingered. Had the monarchy failed in its most basic duty to feel? And perhaps more disturbingly, there were signs that the crown, or at least its courtiers, were attempting to contain the narrative of Diana's death. Subtle, strategic framing of events. Talk of avoiding over-sentimentalizing. Behind the scenes, lobbying to ensure that the royal family wouldn't be blamed, even indirectly, for the culture of media intrusion that had haunted Diana until her final moments. The press, for once, didn't comply. The newspapers that had spent years chasing Diana were now leading tributes, and the public, long trained to revere the monarchy, was suddenly looking it squarely in the eye and asking, "Where were you?" In time, the institution recovered, carefully, cautiously. but it never truly regained the moral authority it had enjoyed before 1997. Diana's death had peeled away the layers of ritual and protocol, exposing a structure that was, at its core, more interested in survival than sincerity. And while the monarchy retreated into managed grief, another scandal was quietly building, one involving a prince, an American financier, and the kind of associations that couldn't be waved away with a handshake or a palace statement. Prince Andrew maintained a friendship with Jeffrey Epstein, even after his conviction. By the late 2000s, Prince Andrew, Duke of York, former naval officer, second son of Queen Elizabeth II, had long carved out his role within the royal family as the unofficial business prince. He was known for globetrotting, rubbing elbows with billionaires, and promoting British trade interests under the banner of soft diplomacy. But one of those billionaires would unravel his public life entirely, Jeffrey Epstein. Even after Epstein was convicted in 2008 for procuring a minor for prostitution, Andrew continued to associate with him. He was photographed walking in Central Park with Epstein in 2010, 2 years after the conviction. That meeting would later be described in various press statements as a mistake or a misjudgment. But it wasn't just the meeting, it was the continued connection. The relationship between Epstein and Andrew wasn't merely passing. Epstein had visited royal properties. He was reportedly present at parties hosted by the prince. And documents later revealed that Epstein paid off some of Andrew's travel-related expenses, further entangling their public and private dealings. Then came the allegations. In 2015, Virginia Giuffre, one of Epstein's most vocal accusers, claimed she had been trafficked to Prince Andrew when she was 17. She alleged that she was forced to have encounters with him on multiple occasions, including in London and on Epstein's private island. Andrew denied the allegations completely, but his denials didn't stop the storm. In 2019, after Epstein was arrested again and later died in jail under controversial circumstances, scrutiny returned to the Duke of York with renewed intensity. In response, Andrew gave a televised interview to the BBC's Newsnight in November 2019, an interview so disastrous, so poorly calculated, it effectively ended his public career. During the interview, Andrew claimed he had no recollection of meeting Giuffre, questioned the authenticity of a photograph of the two of them together, and even suggested he couldn't have been with her at the time because he was at a Pizza Express in Woking. He also stated, bizarrely, that he couldn't sweat, as a way to dispute one of her claims. The fallout was immediate. Charities dropped their associations, public outrage surged, and for the first time, the palace was forced to act decisively. Prince Andrew was stripped of his royal duties and military affiliations. Later, in 2022, he reached a financial settlement with Giuffre in a US civil lawsuit without admitting liability. The royal family framed it as closure, but for many, it was unfinished business. Another example of how the monarchy protects its own until the scandal is too big to ignore. And yet, this wasn't just about one prince's downfall. It exposed a deeper system of royal privilege, legal insulation, and quiet lobbying tools the family had used for years to avoid scrutiny. A system they would deploy again, not to protect one person, but to shield the institution from a law meant to ensure equality. Andrew was accused of sexual misconduct, leading to his royal duties being stripped. There's a particular kind of silence that follows a royal scandal. It's not the absence of sound, it's the presence of carefully measured phrases, tightly controlled messaging, and a sudden wave of no comments. In the case of Prince Andrew, that silence became deafening after 2019, when his name became permanently tethered to one of the most toxic scandals in royal history. The allegations were severe. Virginia Giuffre, who had been trafficked by convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein, claimed that Prince Andrew had engaged with her sexually on multiple occasions when she was a minor under US law. These claims were not whispers in the tabloids. They were laid out in legal documents, supported by sworn statements, and repeated in media interviews. She described encounters in London, New York, and Epstein's private island in the Caribbean. In every instance, she claimed, she had been coerced. In every instance, she named Prince Andrew. From the beginning, Andrew denied all allegations. No admissions, no apologies. Just the firm assertion that he had no memory of ever meeting her, even though a now infamous photo showed them standing together, Giuffre smiling, Andrew's arm around her waist. Ghislaine Maxwell stands behind them in the photo, a key figure in the Epstein operation, later convicted of child trafficking herself. The response from the palace was cautious at first, then urgent. The Newsnight interview intended as a clean-up backfired so dramatically it became a case study in how not to handle crisis communications. Andrew appeared out of touch, evasive, and disturbingly unbothered. He expressed sympathy for Epstein, but not for Epstein's victims. He denied sweating, insisted he was at a Pizza Express in Woking, and tried to explain away his connection to a convicted predator with bureaucratic detachment. Public opinion imploded. Institutions cut ties. The military distanced itself. The Queen, reportedly dismayed by the fallout, acted decisively in early 2022. Andrew was stripped of his military titles and royal patronages. He was instructed to stop using the title His Royal Highness in any official capacity. From public life, he effectively disappeared. In early 2022, Andrew settled a civil lawsuit with Giuffre in the United States. The financial terms were undisclosed, but the message was loud and clear. This wasn't going away. While the settlement came with no admission of guilt, it was, for many, a tacit acknowledgement that the palace had decided to prioritize damage control over public transparency. The royal family tried to frame it as closure, a chapter closed, a lesson learned. But critics pointed out that it only happened after relentless public and legal pressure. That the institution had protected Andrew for years, even while the allegations gained traction. That accountability didn't arrive voluntarily. It arrived when it became impossible to ignore. And once again, the scandal didn't just expose an individual. It pulled back the curtain on how the monarchy operates when challenged. It uses silence as armor, legal loopholes as shields. And when those fail, it quietly redraws the map. A map that, as it turns out, also includes legal exceptions carved out specifically for the crown, especially when it comes to the very laws meant to protect citizens from discrimination. The royals lobbied for laws to exempt themselves from anti-discrimination legislation. When the monarchy is accused of being out of touch, the defense is always the same. They don't make the laws. They don't interfere. They're just symbolic. But symbolism has its privileges. And behind the ceremonial veil, the British royal family has long exercised quiet influence, especially when it comes to laws that might actually hold them accountable. Case in point, The Guardian's 2021 investigation into the royal family's exemption from anti-discrimination legislation. The revelation stemmed from a series of internal government memos from the 1962nd and 1972nd documents that showed Buckingham Palace had lobbied civil servants to ensure that racial and gender equality laws would not apply to the royal household. And they succeeded. Under a mechanism known as Queen's Consent, a little-known but powerful constitutional tool, the monarch must be notified of any legislation that might affect royal interests. In theory, it's just a formality. In practice, it allows the Crown to review and influence draft laws behind closed doors before they're even debated in Parliament. According to the uncovered documents, during the drafting of the 1968 Race Relations Act, a landmark piece of legislation intended to outlaw racial discrimination in the workplace, palace officials pushed for and received exemptions. The result? It became unlawful to discriminate on racial grounds across most of the UK, but not within the royal household. Even as Britain was trying to shed the legacy of its colonial past and embrace a more inclusive future, the royal family was actively lobbying to maintain the right to hire and fire staff without legal obligation to follow anti-discrimination laws. In short, the monarchy had built itself a bubble of immunity. When asked for comment in 2021, the palace responded with a carefully worded denial, stating that the royal household complies with the spirit of the law, but refused to say whether it was formally bound by it. That phrase, the spirit of the law, became a punchline for critics who saw in it a familiar strategy. Claim moral superiority, avoid legal obligation. The implications are staggering. It means that even as the monarchy promotes itself as a symbol of national unity and inclusion, hosting diverse guests, visiting multicultural communities, and giving speeches about equality, it may still be operating under hiring practices that would be illegal anywhere else in the country. This isn't ancient history. The exemptions remain active to this day. The Queen, now Charles, never had to explain them. Parliament never debated them. The public never voted on them. They were simply added to the architecture of royal privilege, like a secret hallway no one else is allowed to walk down. And that privilege doesn't stop at discrimination. It extends into land, income, and lawmaking. Especially when it involves the Duchy of Cornwall, a private estate controlled for decades by the next king, who used his influence not just to protect the estate, but to quietly shape the laws surrounding it. Charles III, as Prince secretly vetted laws to benefit his private estate, Duchy of Cornwall. Before he was king, Charles III was Duke of Cornwall, a title that came not just with prestige, but with an enormous private estate worth over £1 billion. The Duchy of Cornwall isn't a ceremonial relic. It's a modern, highly profitable business empire that includes farms, housing developments, commercial properties, and investments across the UK. And while the estate officially exists to fund the Prince of Wales, Charles treated it as something more, a private kingdom with its own rules, enforced through quiet political influence. The key tool? A constitutional mechanism called Prince's Consent. Less known than Queen's Consent, this allows the heir to the throne to review and potentially amend any legislation that affects his private interests. Unlike a public consultation, this happens in secret. No minutes. No public scrutiny, no accountability. In 2011, an investigation by The Guardian revealed that Charles had vetted at least a dozen bills using Prince's consent. Among them were laws relating to everything from housing and agriculture to leases on the seabed. Several of these affected the Duchy of Cornwall directly, including how its land was taxed, how its assets were regulated, and how its commercial interests were treated under corporate law. For example, one bill allowed the duchy to be exempted from rules requiring transparency in land ownership. Another secured its rights over precious minerals. And yet another affected environmental protections on properties the duchy controlled. Each time, Charles's lawyers were given early access to the draft legislation. Each time, amendments were proposed. And in many cases, they were adopted. The palace insisted Charles was merely exercising a constitutional right, that he was protecting the duchy's interests, not meddling in governance. But critics saw it differently. To them, it was a form of legislative lobbying with a golden seal. It also undermined the royal claim of political neutrality. How can a monarch or a future monarch remain above politics while using legal privilege to shape laws that benefit their bottom line? The duchy itself remains largely exempt from corporation tax. It operates like a business, but enjoys legal privileges other companies do not. And because it is technically part of the royal apparatus, it escapes the transparency and accountability required of public institutions. Charles, now king, has inherited the crown estate, an even larger portfolio. But the shadow of the duchy remains. It tells a story not just of wealth, but of quiet influence. Of laws reviewed before the public sees them. Of loopholes custom-built for a single man. And as always, the monarchy insists it is merely symbolic. But when that symbol bends the law in its favor, hires without legal oversight, and shields vast wealth from public accountability, it stops being a symbol. It becomes something else entirely, a system. One that doesn't just hide scandal but institutionalizes it, as it did with family members the world never even knew existed. Because the next secret isn't about lobbying, it's about disappearance. Charles III's Black Spider memos revealed attempts to meddle in government. Before he was king, before the coronation robes and royal proclamations, Charles III was a letter writer. Not just thank you notes or diplomatic courtesies, but a prolific and persistent campaigner behind closed doors, firing off private letters to ministers, secretaries, and civil servants on everything from architecture to agriculture. These were not passive observations. These were royal interventions, handwritten, underlined, and sometimes scribbled with frustration, hence the nickname, the Black Spider memos. The nickname came from his penmanship, sharp, angular, and crawling across the page like a restless arachnid. But the content of the memos was even more revealing than the handwriting. For years, the public had been told that the royal family, particularly heirs to the throne, remain politically neutral. They do not govern, they do not influence policy, they prepare in silence. Except, Charles wasn't silent. He was busy lobbying. The memos, written between 2004 and 2005, and finally released to the public in 2015 after a decade-long legal battle with The Guardian, unveiled a prince far more politically engaged than previously admitted. In them, Charles pressed ministers on pet causes, alternative medicine, badger culling, military equipment, heritage conservation, school lunches, and a range of other topics that struck his royal nerves. Some letters were lengthy, even preachy. He expressed disappointment, urged ministers to take action, and warned of dire consequences if his concerns were not addressed. He took on everything from rural conservation to the design of hospital buildings. This was not polite curiosity. It was advocacy pointed, specific, and uncomfortably close to political pressure. The palace, predictably, defended him. They called it part of his duty as Prince of Wales to inform himself, to ask questions, to express concern, but critics saw it differently. To them, this was a future king, flexing influence in secret, using private access to shape public policy, with no transparency and no accountability. And that's the real issue. Not that Charles had opinions, who doesn't, but that he had a direct line to the top of government and used it regularly, while the public was told he was waiting patiently in the wings. It was constitutional theatre presenting a neutral monarch in training, while backstage, the script was being quietly rewritten in longhand. The memos themselves didn't topple governments. They weren't criminal, but they raised an essential question. How much political influence is too much when it comes from a man born to reign? Even more unsettling was how long the palace fought to keep them secret. They argued their release would undermine Charles's ability to be king, that it would damage the principle of monarchical neutrality. And yet, if neutrality is so fragile that a few letters can undo it, maybe it was never really there in the first place. Charles would go on to promise greater silence once crowned. But silence is only part of the royal toolkit. The other part is invisibility. And for decades, that's exactly how the monarchy treated certain family members, hiding them not with memos, but with medical files and locked doors. The royals hid family members with disabilities, like cousins Nerissa and Catherine Bowes-Lyon, locked in institutions and declared dead in records. For a family that built its mythology on bloodlines, duty, and the appearance of noble perfection, nothing was more threatening than imperfection, especially if it came from within. And so, in 1941, when two young women, Nerissa and Catherine Bowes-Lyon, were quietly placed in an institution for people with developmental disabilities, there was no press release, no public concern, no family visitation schedule. There was only silence. And then, a lie. Nerissa and Catherine were not distant relatives. They were first cousins of Queen Elizabeth II. Their father, John Herbert Bowes-Lyon, was the brother of Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, which makes what followed not just personal, but institutional. In 1941, the sisters were admitted to the Royal Earlswood Hospital in Surrey. They were young, vulnerable, and permanently hidden from view. Their story might have remained buried forever if not for an accidental unearthing decades later. In the 1980 seconds, Burke's Peerage, a reference Bible of British aristocracy, listed both women as deceased. Specifically, it claimed they had died in the early 1940 seconds. In truth, Nerissa lived until 1986. Catherine, even longer, until 2014. For at least 4 decades, the official record declared them dead while they remained institutionalized, alive but erased. It wasn't a clerical error. It was a choice. When the truth came out first via a newspaper expose in 1987, the palace issued a standard line that the Queen Mother had no knowledge of the women's status. It was, according to spokespersons, an unfortunate family matter, not a royal scandal. But that explanation strained belief. How could a queen consort remain unaware of her nieces being institutionalized? How could 2 members of the royal bloodline vanish without a trace, and no one in the palace know? The more plausible truth is darker. They did know. They just didn't want anyone else to. Reports from the time of the expose painted a stark picture. The sisters had been institutionalized in a government-run facility, not a private one. They lived without royal visits. Their rooms were sparsely decorated. Their clothes were modest, their caretakers unaware of their royal lineage. There was no trace of their identity left, except for the blood that connected them to a family that had decided to forget them. Why? Because in the logic of monarchy, everything is symbolic. The crown must project strength, the bloodline must appear unsullied. And any deviation, whether political, personal, or biological, must be handled out of view, not addressed, not embraced, just quietly filed away. And Nerissa and Catherine weren't the only ones. Later reports uncovered at least 3 more royal cousins with similar conditions, also institutionalized under similar circumstances. Their presence was not denied, but neither was it acknowledged with any transparency or remorse. The story faded, as these stories often do, behind newer scandals, fresher faces, and the tireless PR engine of modern monarchy. But the record stands. 2 royal women were written out of history while still breathing. And for all the Crown's claims of duty, loyalty, and national stewardship, it failed the most basic form of human decency, acknowledging its own. Because sometimes, the deepest secrets of power aren't hidden in vaults or behind legal exemptions. Sometimes they're right there in the family tree, pruned, buried, and crossed out with a pen. The monarchy's fortune partly comes from colonial looting of artifacts, many still displayed in royal collections. Take a stroll through any royal residence, Buckingham Palace, Windsor Castle, the Tower of London, and you're walking through a curated memory. The walls whisper of empire, conquest, ceremony, but they also speak, more quietly, of something else. Acquisition. Or, to put it less diplomatically, looting. Because a significant share of the monarchy's most prized possessions didn't come from diplomatic gift exchanges or family heirlooms, they were extracted from the furthest reaches of the British Empire, often during war, colonization, or convenient treaties. Of course, you won't see that printed on the little display cards. The Royal Collection, one of the largest and most valuable art collections in the world, includes over 1 million items, paintings, sculptures, jewellery, furniture, manuscripts, ceremonial weapons, and religious artifacts. It is owned by the reigning monarch in trust for the nation, but the institution that manages it answers to no elected body. And within that trust lies a darker truth. Many of these objects were never freely given. They were seized in acts of imperial extraction. Take the Benin bronzes, originally from what is now Nigeria. These finely crafted plaques and sculptures were taken in 1897 during a British military raid that razed the Kingdom of Benin. Many ended up in European museums, including pieces absorbed into the royal collections or closely affiliated institutions. Or consider the countless ceremonial weapons and regalia from Ghana, Afghanistan, and India, taken during colonial campaigns and preserved not as cultural artifacts, but as trophies of power. Then there are the sacred items, Ethiopian tablets, altar tablets, Indian idols, Aboriginal ceremonial pieces, all housed in British museums under royal charter or within private royal holdings. These are not just art. They are living symbols of spiritual and cultural identity displayed without context, ownership, or consent. Defenders of the crown often argue that these items were acquired legally at the time, or that they are being preserved for the good of humanity. That repatriation would jeopardize the integrity of collections or subject the artifacts to poor conservation conditions, but the subtext of these arguments is clear. We know better, so we keep what's yours. Repatriation requests have been growing louder in recent years. Countries like India, Nigeria, and South Africa have formally asked for their cultural treasures to be returned. Some museums have begun limited restitution programs, but the monarchy itself has remained almost entirely silent, issuing no commitments, no offers, no public acknowledgement that its glittering heritage comes with colonial fingerprints. Silence is the palace's preferred language in these matters. It avoids the mess of accountability, of confrontation, of admitting that the crown's history is not only filled with pageantry, but also plunder. And while the jewels glint beneath perfect lighting, their origins remain murky, sourced not from artisans' hands, but from empire's grip. And of all those artifacts, none is more infamous nor more emblematic of this dynamic than a diamond with a name, a story, and a controversy that just won't go away. A stone given not in reverence, but under duress. Gifted, supposedly, by a child who had just lost his kingdom. The Koh-i-Noor diamond, centerpiece of the crown jewels, was taken under coercion from a child ruler in India. The Koh-i-Noor is not just a diamond. It's a symbol of empire, of subjugation, of how the British monarchy polished conquest into heritage. For more than 170 years, it has sat in royal crowns, paraded during coronations, and displayed as one of the crown jewels, without ever confronting how it got there. Its story begins long before the British Empire entered the scene. Mined in India's Golconda region, the Koh-i-Noor passed through the hands of Mughals, Persians, Afghans, and Sikhs. Each ruler who held it added a chapter to its legend, seeing the gem as a manifestation of divine right, or at least a very effective way to make an impression. By the mid-19th century, it belonged to the Sikh Empire, specifically to Maharaja Ranjit Singh. When he died in 1839, the British East India Company began eyeing Punjab with new intensity. A few military campaigns and political maneuvers later, the region was annexed in 1849. The reigning monarch at that time, Ranjit Singh's son, Duleep Singh, a boy of 10. As part of the Treaty of Lahore, signed after British victory, Duleep Singh was compelled to gift the Koh-i-Noor to Queen Victoria. This so-called gift was made under British military occupation, with the Sikh Empire dismantled and its court in ruins. It was not a voluntary act, it was the performance of consent under imperial duress. A child, stripped of power, was told to sign away a piece of his dynasty's soul. The diamond was shipped to London, presented to Queen Victoria, and immediately turned into a political symbol. It became part of the royal narrative, proof of dominion of the benevolent empire. Eventually, it was cut down, reshaped, and set into crowns worn by Queen Alexandra, Queen Mary, and, most recently, Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother. At each coronation, it glinted on camera, its origin story reduced to a footnote. But that story hasn't been forgotten elsewhere. India has repeatedly demanded the diamond's return, calling it a stolen national treasure. So has Pakistan and Afghanistan. All three nations have historical claims to it, and all have argued that its continued presence in the crown jewels is an enduring symbol of colonial theft. The British government's position, the diamond was legally acquired, which is one way of saying, we wrote the rules at the time, and the royal family, silent, no statements, no acknowledgement, no movement. Perhaps they understand what the Koh-i-Noor really represents, not just a jewel, but the story of a global power imbalance forged in palaces and battlefields alike. Returning it wouldn't just be about justice, it would be an admission that the empire wasn't always noble, that its treasures came with a price, and that the crown, in all its splendor, was built partly on taking what wasn't offered. And while the diamond remains locked in its velvet case, another story from that same era reveals how protection, too, was doled out unequally, especially during wartime. Some were shielded, some were sent away, and royalty, of course, stayed exactly where it was safest. In World War II, Elizabeth II and Margaret were kept safe in luxury, while London children were evacuated into dangerous conditions. Wartime Britain evokes a particular image, a nation under siege, rationing and resilience, air raid sirens and sandbags, children waving from train windows as they were evacuated from cities into the uncertain countryside. It was the Blitz spirit, the great equalizer, or so the story goes. But like most national myths, the reality had a royal exception. During World War II, over 1 million children were evacuated from London and other major cities to protect them from German bombing raids. These weren't luxury holidays. Families were torn apart. Children arrived in rural towns with no idea where they would live or whether they'd be welcomed. Some were fortunate, many were not. Abuse, malnourishment, and neglect were disturbingly common. The countryside may have been safer from bombs, but it wasn't necessarily safer for children. Meanwhile, Two of the most famous children in the country, Princess Elizabeth, later Queen Elizabeth II, and her younger sister Princess Margaret, were not part of this mass evacuation. Instead, they were moved to Windsor Castle, a royal fortress just 25 miles from central London, and still well within Luftwaffe range. The justification? Security. The palace claimed Windsor was fortified, heavily guarded, and an appropriate place for the heirs to the throne, and they weren't exactly roughing it. The royal sisters were protected by staff, supplied with luxuries that most citizens couldn't dream of, and surrounded by the comforts of privilege. To be clear, no one wanted harm to come to the young princesses, but the optics tell a different story. As working-class children were herded onto trains, their futures handed to strangers, the monarchy chose to protect its own within thick stone walls and manicured isolation. Windsor wasn't untouched by war, it was camouflaged, and its windows were blacked out like every other building, but it wasn't exactly the front line. Elizabeth and Margaret lived in comparative luxury, receiving private tutoring, hosting pantomimes, and even participating in wartime morale projects. It was a kind of curated patriotism, carefully staged and equally carefully shielded. The palace later praised their decision to stay in Britain rather than flee abroad, and indeed, there were discussions early in the war about sending the royal children to Canada. But staying in the country and experiencing war the way the public did were two very different things. What this episode revealed then and now is that even in moments of supposed national unity, the rules of class and privilege never quite disappear. The royals were never going to be packed off to foster homes in Derbyshire. They were never going to line up for powdered milk or sleep in converted barns. Their version of wartime Britain was stylized, selective, and above all, safe. And perhaps that's the quiet tragedy of monarchy. Even in national peril, it can never truly share in the nation's experience. Because while bombs fall indiscriminately, protection is still rationed. And some bloodlines, it seems, are simply born fireproof. The royal household faced accusations of racial bias. When Meghan Markle revealed discussions about her unborn child's skin colour, in the long gallery of royal missteps, few moments have sliced through the gilded facade quite like the now famous 2021 interview between Meghan Markle, Prince Harry, and Oprah Winfrey. What began as a sit-down conversation quickly became something more, a kind of cultural rupture. Not just between the Sussexes and the Crown, but between the mythology of the monarchy and the public's willingness to believe in it. The most haunting revelation was brief, measured, and explosively loaded. During Meghan's pregnancy with their son Archie, there were concerns and conversations within the royal family about how dark his skin might be. Meghan declined to say who made the remark. Harry later clarified it was not the Queen or Prince Philip, but the identity, in some ways, was secondary. The implication was enough. A question had been asked in private that echoed with public consequence. What if the child is too dark for royalty? It wasn't a tabloid leak. It wasn't speculative gossip. It came from Meghan herself, half-black, American, and the first woman of colour to marry into the senior ranks of the British royal family. And it wasn't just about a comment. It was about what the comment revealed. That even within the highest echelons of a family that styles itself as national, above politics, above prejudice, there were still whispered calculations about bloodlines, appearance, and acceptability. The palace responded the way it always does, carefully. A short statement was issued. "Recollections may vary," it said, in what has become one of the most delicately devastating phrases in royal PR history. But the institution did not deny that the conversation happened, nor did it name the person involved. In the space between those two silences, public trust wobbled. Some called the allegation impossible to verify. Others called it impossible to ignore. But in the global court of public opinion, especially outside the UK, the damage was already done. The monarchy was no longer just navigating scandals of protocol and expense reports. It was being accused of something far more corrosive: racial bias from within its own walls. For supporters of the monarchy, the defense came swiftly. The firm isn't racist, just rigid. Meghan misunderstood the culture. She was too sensitive, too American, too used to media freedoms that clashed with royal stoicism. But those defenses sounded familiar, eerily similar to those used by institutions that have always mistaken silence for stability. To many, this wasn't an isolated remark, it was the final straw. The microaggressions Meghan had endured from the press suddenly had context. The absence of royal protection made more sense. And the couple's eventual departure from royal duties looked less like rebellion and more like retreat from an environment that had no interest in evolving. The question about Archie's skin colour was never answered, but it asked something far more pressing. Can a monarchy built on bloodlines truly welcome difference? Or does it simply tolerate it until it becomes inconvenient? And as Meghan's revelations continued, that tolerance or lack of it would become even harder to defend. Because behind the surface-level drama of tiaras and press briefings was a deeper, more human confession that in her darkest moments, inside the palace walls, she reached out for help and was met with nothing but protocol. Meghan also revealed she was denied help for suicidal thoughts while inside the royal institution. There's a strange myth about palaces that the walls protect you, that once inside you are somehow safer, guarded by tradition, privilege, and the reassuring weight of centuries. But for Meghan Markle, those same walls became something else entirely, a gilded trap where even the most basic appeals for help disappeared into a hierarchy of silence. In her interview with Oprah Winfrey, Meghan revealed a moment of striking vulnerability. During her pregnancy, under relentless tabloid scrutiny and internal pressures from the institution, she began experiencing mental health struggles. She reached out directly, urgently for help. Not from the press, not from social media, from within the very institution that claimed to protect its own. And the answer, according to her, was no. She says she was told that seeking treatment or even speaking publicly about her mental health would reflect poorly on the institution, that it would damage the Crown's image, that it simply wasn't done. And so, a young woman, pregnant, isolated, and struggling, was told, in essence, endure it quietly. This wasn't the 1,800 seconds. It was the 2,020 seconds. And yet the culture Meghan described echoed something deeply archaic. A fear that personal imperfection, even mental health, could tarnish the polished surface of monarchy. Because the problem wasn't that Meghan was struggling, it was that she might say so out loud. Critics of the interview were quick to question the accuracy. They pointed to gaps in timelines. They argued that the royal family funds numerous mental health charities, so how could it deny help to one of its own? But the contradiction only deepened the mystery. If mental health awareness is a core royal issue, why didn't it apply inside the palace gates? Meghan's experience, true or not, struck a nerve because it highlighted an ancient paradox at the heart of monarchy. The more symbolic your existence, the less human you're allowed to be. Royals are supposed to smile, wave, represent. They are not supposed to struggle, at least not in public, and certainly not in ways that challenge the institution's carefully maintained image. The palace responded with restraint, acknowledging Meghan's testimony without committing to any real introspection. No royal stepped forward to contradict her account, nor to validate it. It was a masterclass in institutional non-engagement. Nothing was confirmed, nothing was denied. Everything was quietly absorbed into the machine. But the image had already cracked. Because if the Crown cannot support one of its most visible members during a crisis, if its protocols matter more than people, what exactly is it preserving? The irony, of course, is that the monarchy campaigns for mental health awareness in public, cutting ribbons, funding charities, and giving speeches about openness. But when one of its own asked for help in private, she was told to smile for the cameras. And when the cameras zoom in too far when coverage turns unflattering, there's a tool in the royal arsenal for that too. Not compassion, not transparency, something more effective. Silence by design. The monarchy actively pressures media through denotices to silence damaging stories. In a constitutional monarchy, the royal family is supposed to be symbolic, decorative, a legacy institution floating above the rough waters of political life. But in practice, it has tools, real, tangible mechanisms to shape what the public sees, hears, and remembers. One of the quietest and most potent among them is the D-Notice, short for Defence and Security Media Advisory Notice. A D-Notice is a request issued to news editors by the UK government, advising them not to publish or broadcast information on specified subjects for reasons of national security. In theory, it's about protecting lives, military secrets, or diplomatic missions. But in practice, it has sometimes been used to shield the image of the monarchy. While D-Notices are voluntary, they carry weight. Editors comply not just out of patriotism, but out of fear of legal reprisal, access restrictions, or political fallout. And though rarely discussed, several journalists and media insiders over the decades have hinted, sometimes publicly, often anonymously, that stories involving the royal family have been quietly killed, delayed, or watered down after the issuance of these notices. Of course, the palace never confirms this. The system thrives on ambiguity. Some of the stories in question reportedly involve royal finances, internal conflicts, personal scandals, and questions of legitimacy. And while not every rumour deserves daylight, the broader implication is chilling. The monarchy, despite claiming neutrality, has a direct line to the very institutions tasked with holding it accountable. Even beyond D-Notices, there exists a network of royal correspondents, editors, and press secretaries that functions more like a diplomatic corps than a media environment. Access is everything. Reporters who play nice, who stick to ceremonial fluff and royal baby updates, are rewarded with exclusives, invitations, and briefings. Step out of line, and the drawbridge lifts. This has created what some have called the royal media bubble, a self-reinforcing ecosystem where criticism is softened, questions are deflected, and scandals are managed through mutual understanding rather than investigative reporting. For an institution that purports to belong to the people, the monarchy exerts an uncanny degree of control over how it is perceived. It's not censorship in the overt, state-controlled sense. It's subtler than that. It's about framing, access, and timing. About making certain stories disappear, not with outrage, but with a phone call. To the public, the monarchy is open and televised. To the press, it's accessible if you play by the rules. But to those who ask the wrong questions, the Crown remains what it has always been. An institution that speaks when it chooses and disappears when it must. And when disappearing isn't enough, there's another method, something even more permanent. Sometimes the best way to keep a secret is to write it out of the law itself. Reports suggest the royals pushed censorship exemptions from the Freedom of Information Act. If you want to know how a government really works, you don't just look at what it says, you look at what it refuses to disclose. That's the point of the Freedom of Information Act. To force public institutions into the light, to let ordinary people examine how decisions are made, where money goes, and who's pulling the strings. At least, that's the idea. Unless, of course, you happen to be the British royal family who managed to write themselves right out of that obligation. It wasn't always this way. When FOIA was first drafted in the late 1992, it included provisions for the monarchy, but with a twist. While other public bodies were required to respond to FOIA requests, the royals were granted qualified exemptions. That meant information could be withheld if disclosure might prejudice the Crown's ability to carry out constitutional functions. Vague? Definitely. But not absolute. Then came the real change. In 2010, just before the law was due to fully apply to senior royals, the government, under pressure from Buckingham Palace, according to reports, passed an amendment. It granted the Queen, the Prince of Wales, and the second in line to the throne absolute exemptions from the Act. Not just partial protection, not just special review, absolute, permanent secrecy. Their records could not be requested. Their decisions, letters, communications, expenses, none of it could be accessed by journalists, historians, or the public. The justification, as always, was constitutional. The monarchy needed privacy to remain politically neutral, but critics pointed out that the real reason may have had more to do with politics than neutrality. The amendment came after several years of mounting pressure to disclose how the royals used their influence, particularly in matters involving Prince Charles's infamous lobbying letters, the Black Spider memos, which had still not been released at that time. Once it became clear that transparency might lead to embarrassment, the law was changed. This wasn't a clerical footnote. It was a transformation of the public's right to know tailored for one family. The move drew outrage from transparency advocates. The Campaign for Freedom of Information called it a retrograde and undemocratic step. Journalists saw it as a precedent that undermined the entire logic of FOIA. If the monarchy, funded by taxpayers, granted vast privilege, and playing a symbolic national role, could operate in complete secrecy, what exactly was being safeguarded? Tradition or accountability? To this day, the royal exemption stands. Ministers can be FOIA'd. Departments can be investigated. But the royal household remains a sealed box. Even internal correspondence between civil servants and palace officials can be withheld, on the grounds that the sovereign's affairs must remain beyond political controversy. In reality, what's beyond controversy is often just what's been rendered untouchable by design. And in a twist that's either poetic or perverse, this push for secrecy happened at the same time the royal family was expanding its wealth, securing legal exemptions, and navigating public scrutiny. Because when the spotlight gets too hot, the crown doesn't just dim it, it rewires the bulb. Which brings us to the final irony. While you may never be allowed to know what they spend, say, or influence, you're still indirectly paying for it. And the institution at the center of that financial mystery, the Crown Estate itself, massive, profitable, and conveniently unaccountable. Even today, the Crown Estates remain unaccountable to taxpayers, enriching the royal family, while ordinary people struggle. If you've ever heard the argument that the British monarchy pays for itself, it's usually followed by some reference to the Crown Estate, an empire within an empire. Vast, lucrative, and just murky enough to keep the numbers fuzzy. But here's what matters. While the Crown Estate technically belongs to the sovereign in right of the nation, it doesn't operate like a public body. It operates like a fortress of cash, ring-fenced by law, insulated from democratic oversight, and quietly churning out wealth. Let's break that down. The Crown Estate owns about £10 billion worth of property. Prime real estate in London, rural land across the UK, commercial spaces, shopping centres, even the seabed surrounding the British Isles. It's a property portfolio so enormous it affects national energy policy. Literally, if you want to install an offshore wind farm, chances are you'll be negotiating with the Crown Estate, not the government. The Crown. Each year, profits from the estate go to the UK Treasury, and in return, the monarch receives a percentage as a sovereign grant currently set at 25%. Originally, it was 15%, but it was increased to help fund Buckingham Palace's essential renovations. Those renovations are still underway. The 25% is still in place. Now, this would be one thing if the sovereign grant behaved like a fixed budget, but it doesn't. It scales. As the Crown Estate's profits grow, so does the grant. In years when wind energy leases boom or London property values spike, the monarchy gets an automatic raise. Meanwhile, nurses strike, rent climbs, and food banks become normal. The palace argues that the sovereign grant funds essential public-facing duties. State visits, ceremonial events, staff salaries. But critics point out that the line between royal spending and royal indulgence is suspiciously blurry. New curtains for a stateroom? Sure. But what about private apartments? What about travel for non-working royals? What about unreported lobbying expenses? Adding to the confusion is the way the estate itself is treated under law. It's technically a public asset, but not subject to freedom of information laws. It's run like a business, but doesn't pay corporation tax. It's owned by the Crown, but not by the monarch personally. And yet the monarch can't sell it but benefits from it. A legal Schrödinger's cat of property ownership. And through it all, the same refrain echoes from the palace. This is all for the nation. But the nation doesn't get a line-item breakdown. The nation can't audit the books. The nation is just meant to smile when the crown jewels come out, nod during the pageantry, and trust that somewhere behind those red velvet ropes, everything is being managed responsibly. It's a curious kind of arrangement, one that lives in the tension between ceremony and silence, wealth without receipts, power without politics, ownership without accountability. And maybe that's the final mystery of the monarchy, not just what it hides, but what it convinces the public to never ask for. Because in the House of Windsor, the darkest secrets don't just live in the past. They live in the balance sheets of today, and the ledgers that no one, by design, is ever allowed to read.